Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something brutal. You've survived pandemics, you've survived medieval famines, so yeah, you probably won't survive this for sure. But let's pretend it's June 1941 and you're living in Leningrad, one of the most beautiful cities in the Soviet Union. You've got no idea that in a few months you'll be trapped in the longest, deadliest siege in modern history. 900 days of starvation, cold and artillery fire that turned a thriving metropolis into a frozen graveyard. But the real question is, what does it take to survive when there's no food, no heat, and no way out? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not going to guilt trip you with a ration card over it. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching this down in the comments. I love knowing who else is awake during these quiet hours, learning about history's darkest chapters. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket because you're going to need it, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in Leningrad on June 22nd, 1941, and your pillow is surprisingly soft compared to what's coming. The morning sun filters through your apartment window overlooking the Neva River, casting golden patterns across your wooden floor. You stretch, feeling the familiar creak of old floorboards beneath your feet. The air smells like fresh bread from the bakery downstairs and the faint metallic scent of the river. Your breakfast waits on the table, real butter, actual white bread, maybe even some jam your neighbour traded for last week. It tastes like normalcy, like the world makes sense. You probably don't realise you're eating better than you will for the next 872 days. Actually, scratch that, you won't be eating much of anything that resembles food. The radio crackles to life in the corner, and suddenly the announcer's voice cuts through your morning routine like a knife through that soft bread you're enjoying. Citizens of the Soviet Union at 4 o'clock this morning, without declaration of war, and without any claims being made on the Soviet Union, German troops attacked our country. You pause, butter-laden knife halfway to your mouth. The words hit you like cold water, but your brain doesn't quite process them yet. War? Here? The bread tastes different now, like the last meal before everything falls apart. Which, spoiler alert, it basically is. Outside your window, Leningrad looks exactly the same as it did yesterday. The same golden spires pierce the sky, the same elegant bridges arch over the canals, the same people hurry along the sidewalks below. But something invisible has shifted, like the moment before an avalanche, when the mountain looks perfectly stable, but the snow is already starting to slip. Your neighbour, Mrs. Kozlova, knocks on your door with that particular rhythm that means she has gossip. When you open it, her face tells you this isn't about who's been stealing milk from the communal refrigerator. Her eyes are wide, scared, and she's clutching her radio like it might bite her. "Did you hear?" she whispers, though there's no one around to overhear. "The Germans, they're coming this way." You invite her in for tea, because that's what civilized people do when the world ends. Your kettle whistles cheerfully, oblivious to the fact that soon you'll be burning furniture just to melt snow for drinking water. The tea is hot, sweet, perfect. Everything tea won't be for the next 2.5 years. Through your window you can see people gathering in small groups on the street corners, their voices carrying up to your third-floor apartment. They're talking fast, gesturing wildly, and you catch fragments. Mobilization? How long before... should we leave? Mrs. Kozlova sips her tea and says what everyone is thinking, but nobody wants to voice. What if they get here? You reassure her that Leningrad is too important, too well defended, too proud to fall. The Red Army will stop them long before they reach the city limits. You say this with the confidence of someone who has never seen a panzer division roll across a frozen field. But here's what you don't know yet. The Germans aren't planning to capture Leningrad. They're planning something much worse. Hitler has already decided that your city, with its 3 million residents, will simply cease to exist. Not occupation, not conquest, erasure. Like taking an eraser to a map and rubbing until there's nothing left but empty space where Europe's most beautiful city used to be. The morning passes strangely, suspended between normalcy and catastrophe. You go through the motions of a regular day, washing dishes, making your bed, planning what to cook for dinner. These simple acts feel both meaningless and precious, like performing a play for an audience that's already left the theatre. By afternoon, the city has transformed without changing. The same streets, the same buildings, but now they pulse with a different energy. Men are already lining up at recruitment centres, Women are stockpiling whatever food they can find, and children are being pulled closer to their mothers' sides. The war has arrived without a single German soldier setting foot in the city. You end your last normal day by looking out at the white night sky, that magical Leningrad phenomenon where summer darkness never quite arrives. The sun hovers just below the horizon, painting everything in ethereal twilight. It's beautiful enough to make you forget for just a moment that everything you know is about to disappear. Tomorrow, you'll wake up in a city under siege, though you won't know it yet. The breadlines will start forming, the evacuations will begin, and you'll take your first steps down a path that leads through hunger, cold, and horrors you can't imagine from the comfort of your warm apartment. But tonight, in the pale glow of the white nights, you're still living in the world you've always known. Enjoy it. You won't see it again. You wake up 3 months later, and your pillow is now a bundled-up coat. September in Leningrad usually means crisp mornings and golden leaves, but this September tastes like smoke and sounds like distant artillery. The siege ring closed 2 weeks ago, on September 8th, though nobody used that word yet. They called it temporary difficulties with supply routes, which is like calling a house fire a heating issue. Your apartment is colder now, not winter cold, but this kind of chill that seeps into the buildings when there's not quite enough fuel to keep the heat on all day. You've already started wearing sweaters indoors, though you tell yourself it's just because autumn came early this year. Outside, the city looks almost normal if you don't notice the boarded-up windows and anti-aircraft guns sprouting from rooftops like metallic flowers. The bread ration dropped again yesterday. You hold your daily portion in your palm. 400 grams for workers, less for everyone else, and it feels lighter than it should. The bread itself is different. Darker, denser, with a strange aftertaste that makes you think of sawdust and regret. Because fun fact, that's partially what it is. The bakers are already mixing in whatever they can find to stretch the grain supplies, and your morning slice now contains about as much actual wheat as a particle board. You queue for bread in the grey dawn light, surrounded by neighbours who look increasingly like strangers. Mrs. Kozlova stands 3 spots ahead of you, but she's changed. Her coat hangs looser, her face has new lines around the eyes, and when she smiles it doesn't quite reach those eyes anymore. Everyone's smile has become a performance now, a way of pretending everything is still manageable. The queue moves slowly, and you pass the time by listening to conversations that all follow the same pattern. Someone mentions hearing artillery fire last night. Someone else insists it was just thunder, and everyone nods like they believe it. The city has developed a collective talent for creative interpretation. Those aren't German planes overhead, they're Soviet fighters on manoeuvres. That smoke on the horizon isn't burning warehouses, it's controlled burns to clear fields. That distant rumbling isn't enemy tanks, it's construction work on the metro extension. When you finally reach the bread counter, the clerk, a thin woman with flour under her fingernails, weighs your portion twice. Every gram matters now, though you don't realise yet just how much each gram will matter. She marks your ration card with a pencil stub, and you notice her hand shake slightly. Not from cold, though the shop is chilly. From hunger. She's already showing the first signs of what will soon have a name: alimentary dystrophy. Starvation, but with a medical term that makes it sound manageable. You walk home past buildings that have grown strange appendages, sandbags around entrances, wooden boards over windows, and painted signs pointing to bomb shelters. The city is transforming itself into a fortress. But fortresses work both ways. They keep enemies out, but they also keep defenders in. Leningrad is becoming a beautiful, elaborate trap, and you're inside it. Your neighbour Pavel stops you in the courtyard. He's holding a letter from his son, who's been sent to dig anti-tank ditches somewhere south of the city. "Good news," Pavel says, but his voice carries no joy. Dmitri says the fortifications are coming along well, says the Germans will never break through. He shows you the letter, and you notice it's dated 3 weeks ago. Pavel hasn't heard from his son since. In your apartment, you spread a map on your kitchen table, the same table where you ate that buttered bread 3 months ago. The map shows the Leningrad region, and you mark the latest positions you've heard about on the radio. German forces to the south, near Gachina, Finnish forces to the north, along the old border, and to the east, Lake Ladoga, that massive inland sea that stretches beyond the horizon. You trace the perimeter with your finger, and suddenly understand what you didn't want to admit. Leningrad is surrounded. Not partially, not temporarily, completely. The only way out is across that lake, and winter is coming. Soon even the lake will be frozen solid, cutting off the last possible escape route. But here's what the maps don't show. Hitler's real plan for your city. While you're worrying about military conquest, German High Command has already decided that conquest isn't the goal. They want Leningrad to disappear entirely. Not just defeated, not just occupied, but erased from existence. Every man, woman and child, every building, every street, every memory. After the population dies off, or from starvation, cold and disease, the Wehrmacht will level whatever remains and hand the empty land to Finland. It's genocide with a clean conscience. No mass shootings, no gas chambers, just a blockade and patience. Let winter and hunger do the work while German soldiers keep their hands technically clean. They call it death by attrition, which sounds so much more civilized than mass murder of civilians. The radio announces new regulations, reduced rations, restricted movement between districts, mandatory registration for all remaining residents. They frame it as temporary wartime measures, but you're beginning to understand that temporary might last longer than anyone imagined. That evening you stand at your window watching the sunset paint the city gold and red. The Neva flows past, indifferent to human schemes, and for a moment you can almost pretend it's just another autumn evening in the most beautiful city in Russia. Almost. Tomorrow you'll wake up in a city that's been surrounded for 17 days. The trap is closing, though you don't know it yet. And winter, the ally that saved Russia from Napoleon N, that stopped the Germans at Moscow, winter is about to become your greatest enemy. You wake up in December, and your pillow is now 2 sweaters wrapped around a book. Your apartment is cold enough that you can see your breath, and the windows have grown fantastic ice patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't inside the glass. The heating stopped 3 weeks ago, not officially, just gradually. The way warmth seeps out of a dying body. The bread ration is now 125 grams. To put this in perspective, that's about 2 thin slices of what used to be bread, but now resembles something between cardboard and sawdust with delusions of nutrition. You hold your daily portion and realise it weighs less than your smartphone would if smartphones existed in 1941, which they don't, leaving you without the small comfort of angry tweets about your situation. Your morning routine has evolved into something your past self wouldn't recognise. You wake up, check that you're still alive. This is not a joke. People sometimes don't wake up anymore, then immediately think about food. Not breakfast, not a meal, just food in the abstract. When will you eat your bread? Should you save half for later? Can you make it seem like more if you cut it into smaller pieces and eat them slowly? The queue for bread now starts forming before dawn. You join it in darkness, stamping your feet to keep circulation going, soon surrounded by the shapes that might be your neighbours but could be anyone. In the cold and dark, wrapped in layers of clothing, everyone looks the same, hunched, anonymous figures united only by hunger and determination. Mrs. Kozlova hasn't been in the queue for a week. You haven't seen her at all, actually, and when you knock on her door, no one answers. The silence has a particular quality that makes you not want to knock again. Some silences are temporary, others are permanent. The woman in front of you in the bread queue, you don't know her name, but you've been sharing this misery for weeks, mentions that her sister heard from someone who knows a baker that the bread now contains flour made from flour bags. Not just the flour that might have clung to the bags, but the bags themselves, ground up and mixed in. Your breakfast is seasoned with jute and cotton fibres, which explains the strange texture and the way it sits in your stomach like wet cement. When you finally get your bread, you notice the baker's hands are shaking worse than last week. She's a large woman, was a large woman, but now her coat hangs on her like a tent on poles. She weighs your portion 3 times, not because she's being careful with your ration, but because her hands keep trembling and dropping the bread. Each time she has to pick it up and start over, and each time you all pretend this is normal. Walking home, you pass the Haymarket, where a strange new economy has emerged. People trade things that once seemed worthless for things that once seemed essential. A woman offers her wedding ring for a handful of sunflower seeds. A man trades a violin for a jar of pickled vegetables. 2 children, unsupervised, try to swap a book for an apple core someone threw away. You stop at one trading cluster where someone is selling what they claim is meat. It's dark, tough-looking, and has a smell that makes your empty stomach clench with both hunger and revulsion. The seller, a thin man with hollow eyes, won't quite meet your gaze when you ask what kind of meat it is. He just says protein and quotes a price that would have bought you a good meal at a restaurant 4 months ago. Now it might buy you enough questionable protein to delay starvation for another day. Back in your apartment, you perform the ritual that's become the most important part of your day. You eat your bread, but not quickly, not carelessly. You cut it into 6 pieces, then eat 1 piece every 2 hours. Each bite gets chewed slowly, thoroughly, until it's liquid in your mouth. This isn't just about making it last, it's about extracting every possible calorie, every molecule of nutrition from those 125 grams. Between bread portions, you drink hot water, not tea. There is no tea. Not coffee. Coffee is a memory. Just hot water, because warmth tricks your stomach into feeling fullable for a few minutes. Your body is learning new forms of self-deception, and you're grateful for every trick it can master. The radio still broadcasts, but the news has become surreal. Announcements about production victories at factories that no longer exist. Updates on battles happening hundreds of miles away. Patriotic songs that sound increasingly hollow when your main concern is whether you'll live to see tomorrow. The government admits to difficulties with food supply, but insists that the situation is well in hand. This is like saying the Titanic had minor flooding issues. Your diary bout, you've started keeping one, because something in you insists that this experience needs to be recorded, contains entries that your past self would have found impossible to believe. Found potato peel in courtyard, boiled and ate, tasted wonderful. Neighbour fell down in hallway, too weak to get up, helped him inside. He gave me 3 sunflower seeds as thanks. The city is changing in ways that have nothing to do with bombs or artillery. Buildings stand empty as their residents simply disappear. Not from evacuations, which stopped months ago, but from the quiet mathematics of starvation. Neighbourhoods grow silent. Shops close not because they're bombed, but because there's nothing left to sell. Yet somehow people still go to work. Not everyone, and not every day, but enough to keep some version of civilization functioning. The Kirov factory still produces tanks, though the workers can barely lift their tools. The library still opens, though the librarians have burned half the catalogue for warmth. The orchestra still plays, though 2 violinists collapsed during last week's concert. Tonight, as you prepare for another night in your increasingly cold apartment, you realise that you've crossed some invisible line. This isn't temporary hardship anymore, it's a new form of existence. You're not waiting for things to return to normal, you're adapting to a reality where normal might never come back, and winter has only just begun. You wake up in January, and your pillow is now a dictionary wrapped in a thin blanket. Your apartment is cold enough that water left in a glass overnight has a skin of ice on top. The heating pipes haven't made a sound in weeks. They're not broken, they're just empty, like arteries in a corpse. Outside, the temperature reads -28 Celsius, which is the kind of cold that turns spit into crystals before it hits the ground. Your body has become a stranger to you. When you swing your legs out of bed, they feel disconnected, like borrowed limbs you haven't quite learned to operate. Your hip bones press against the mattress in ways they never did before, and when you stand, the room sways slightly. Not from dizziness exactly, but from your body's new relationship with gravity. You're lighter now, less substantial, as if you're slowly becoming transparent. The mirror in your bathroom tells a story you don't want to read. Your face has developed new architecture, cheekbones that stand out like cliff edges, eye sockets that have become caves, temples with hollows deep enough to cast shadows. Your skin has taken on a strange quality, papery and greyish, and your hair comes out in small handfuls when you run your fingers through it. This is what 125 grams of bread per day looks like after 2 months. The bread ration changed again yesterday. Not reduced, it can't go much lower and still be called food, but altered. The baker, who looks like she's auditioning for her own ghost, explains apologetically that they are now mixing in cellulose, wood pulp, essentially. Your breakfast is now part tree, which might be poetic if it weren't so literally true. You're becoming a creature that eats forests and dreams of wheat. In the bread queue, nobody talks about being hungry anymore. That would be like discussing whether water is wet, too obvious to mention. Instead, people share practical tips with the efficiency of survival experts. Someone mentions that pine bark, if boiled long enough, provides minimal nutrition. Another person whispers that leather belts, if you cut them into small pieces and stew them for hours, become almost chewable. Mrs. Kozlova's apartment has been empty for 3 weeks now. The door isn't locked. Locks have become meaningless when there's nothing left to steal. You finally gather the courage to look inside and find it exactly as she left it, except colder. Her bed is made, her few remaining possessions arranged neatly, and on her kitchen table sits a note in shaky handwriting. For whoever finds this, there are matches in the drawer. Use them wisely. Your body is teaching you new lessons every day. Hunger, you discover, isn't just an empty feeling in your stomach. It's a full-body experience. Your muscles ache constantly, not from exercise, but from the effort of simply existing. Your teeth feel loose in your gums. Your heart beats with an irregular rhythm, like a drum played by someone who's forgotten the song. Most strangely, your sense of smell has become supernaturally acute. You can detect food from blocks away, though what your nose identifies as food now includes things that would have disgusted you 6 months ago. The medical term for what's happening to you is alimentary dystrophy, but the people of Leningrad have coined their own vocabulary. They call the walking skeletons dystrophics, and they divide them into categories. Stage 1, you're weak but still functional. Stage 2, you can barely walk, your skin takes on a waxy pallor, and you begin to retain water in strange places. Your legs swell while your face becomes gaunt. Stage 3, you don't get up anymore. You're still in stage 1, but you can feel stage 2 beckoning like a patient friend. Sometimes when you stand up quickly, the world greys out at the edges. Sometimes you find yourself staring at nothing for long periods, not thinking, just conserving energy like a machine running on backup power. Your mind has become very good at turning itself off to save calories. The city's rhythm has changed to match its inhabitants' declining energy. People move more slowly, speak more softly, sleep longer. The bustling pace of a major metropolitan area has been replaced by the deliberate movements of invalids. Even the children, those who remain, play quiet games that require minimal effort. Tag has been replaced by storytelling. Running has been replaced by sitting. At work, yes, you still go to work because routine is sometimes the only thing standing between a person and collapse. Your colleagues have developed a strange etiquette around their shared deterioration. Nobody mentions when someone doesn't show up for a few days. Nobody comments on how much weight their desk mate has lost. Nobody discusses the way everyone's handwriting has become shakier, or how meetings now include long pauses where people forget what they were saying mid-sentence. Your dreams have become vivid and almost exclusively about food. Not gourmet meals or fancy restaurants, but simple abundance. Bread thick enough to sink your teeth into. Butter that comes in blocks rather than memories. Apples that crunch when you bite them. You wake from these dreams with saliva in your mouth and tears on your face, and it takes several minutes to remember where and when you are. The strangest part is how quickly this has become normal. Your shrinking body, the constant cold, the way you ration your breath when climbing stairs, all of this has become routine with shocking speed. Human beings, you're learning, can adapt to almost anything, if they do it gradually enough. You're like a frog in slowly boiling water, except the water is freezing and the pot is a city of 3 million people learning to die quietly. But you're not dead yet. That's the important thing to remember as you prepare for another night in your ice-cold apartment wrapped in every piece of clothing you own. You're not dead yet. And tomorrow there will be another 125 grams of bread, and another day of this strange new existence. You're mastering one small survival at a time. You wake up in February, and your pillow is now a coat stuffed with newspaper. The newspaper is from October, back when the headlines still talked about temporary setbacks and strategic repositioning. Now those optimistic words serve as insulation between your head and the frozen floor, which seems like an appropriate metaphor for something, though your calorie-starved brain can't quite grasp what. The bread ration hasn't changed in 2 weeks, which counts as stability in your new world. 125 grams of what technically qualifies as bread but resembles something between pressed sawdust and regret. You've learned to eat it in microscopic bites, chewing each piece until it liquefies, making the experience last 45 minutes instead of 4. Time dilation through starvation. It's like Einstein's relativity, but powered by hunger instead of physics. The city has developed its own twisted economy, where the normal rules of value have been turned upside down and shaken until only the most essential things remain. Gold jewellery trades for mouldy potatoes, fur coats exchange hands for a jar of grain. Yesterday you watched a woman trade what looked like a family heirloom, an ornate silver samovar for a cup of cooking oil and 3 frozen turnips. The man who made the trade handled the samovar carefully, but you could tell he was already mentally converting it into fuel for his stove. Mrs. Antonova from the 4th floor has become the unofficial broker for these desperate transactions, not because she's particularly business-minded, but because she has a knack for finding things people need and connecting them with people who have those things. She operates out of the building's courtyard, speaking in whispers and conducting trades with the solemnity of state negotiations. Yesterday she helped arrange an exchange where someone traded a violin for enough firewood to heat a room for 3 days. The violin was beautiful, handcrafted, probably worth more than most people's monthly salary in the before times. Now it's worth about 15 hours of warmth. The barter system has its own unspoken rules. Nobody asks where items came from originally. Nobody mentions the obvious fact that people are trading away their last valuable possessions to delay starvation by a few more days. And nobody talks about what happens when you've traded away everything, and the hunger is still there, patient and relentless as winter itself. You've started noticing details about your neighbours that hunger makes impossible to ignore. Pavel from downstairs has developed a particular way of walking, slow and careful, like someone navigating a ship in rough seas. His daughter Marina, who used to bounce up and down the stairs, now climbs them one at a time, pausing to rest on each landing. She's 12 years old and moves like an elderly person with arthritis. The children are the hardest to watch. Not because they complain, they don't, which is somehow worse, but because you can see them shrinking in real time. Their clothes hang loose, their eyes seem too large for their faces, and they've developed an adult wariness that no child should possess. They play quiet games now, conserving energy, and their laughter has become rare and precious as fresh fruit. At the bread distribution centre, you've noticed that the clerk has started doing something new. When elderly people or children come to collect their rations, she sometimes presses an extra small piece into their hands while looking the other way. It's dangerous. She could be shot for stealing state resources, but she does it anyway. These tiny acts of rebellion against death have become the city's real currency. Your work has become surreal. The office still opens, though half the desks remain empty. Their occupants either evacuated, dead, or too weak to make the journey. Those who still show up go through the motions of their old jobs with the dedication of actors in a play nobody's watching. Reports get written about production quotas at factories that have no raw materials. Meetings get scheduled to discuss projects that everyone knows will never be completed. It's like maintaining the ceremony of normal life while the substance slowly dissolves. The radio broadcasts have taken on an otherworldly quality. Announcements about military victories on distant fronts feel like news from another planet. Updates about increased industrial production sound like fiction read aloud. The government's reassuring messages about adequate food supplies would be funny if you had the energy to laugh. Instead, you listen with the detached interest of someone overhearing a conversation in a language they don't speak. Your diary entries have become minimalist, not from artistic choice, but from energy conservation. Day 157. Bread. Still cold. Mrs. K found turnip frozen in courtyard. Shared. These simple sentences contain entire universes of experience, the effort required to write them, the careful allocation of pencil lead, the way sharing a single frozen turnip among 4 people can feel like a feast. The city's infrastructure is failing in slow motion. Water pipes freeze and burst, leaving entire buildings without running water. Electricity comes and goes unpredictably, usually going. The garbage collection stopped weeks ago, though there's not much garbage anymore. Everything that could possibly be useful gets repurposed, and everything else is burned for heat. The streets are developing a layer of debris and ice that makes walking treacherous, but nobody has the energy to maintain them. Yet somehow, impossibly, life continues. Not the life you knew before, but a stripped-down version focused entirely on the basic mechanics of survival. People still fall in love, though their courtships now involve sharing body heat rather than romantic dinners. Families still care for each other, though care now means giving someone else part of your bread ration. Children still attend school, though the curriculum has been reduced to basic literacy and arithmetic, and the classrooms are so cold that students keep their mittens on while writing. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep in your frozen apartment, you realise that you've become part of something unprecedented in human history. A citywide experiment in how long people can survive on almost nothing. You're living data points in a study nobody wanted to conduct, and the results are being written in hunger and endurance and the quiet heroism of people who get up each morning to face another impossible day. The fascinating thing is that you're still getting up. You wake up in March and your pillow is now a bundle of rags wrapped around a book titled The Joy of Cooking, which has become either the cruelest irony or the most desperate hope in your apartment. Outside, spring is theoretically approaching, but you wouldn't know it from the ice still coating your windows or the way your breath forms clouds inside your room. Winter has outlasted its seasonal welcome and settled in like a guest who's forgotten how to leave. The walk to the bread queue has become a journey through a city that's learning to die gracefully. Bodies appear overnight on sidewalks, in doorways, sometimes just sitting on benches as if they decided to rest and never quite managed to get up again. They're covered with snow by morning, which gives them a peaceful, sculptural quality that might be beautiful if you could forget they used to be your neighbours. Mrs. Volkov, who lived 2 buildings down, sits on the steps outside her apartment building. She's been there since yesterday, and nobody has moved her. Not because people don't care, but because moving bodies requires energy nobody has, and because the official collection services are overwhelmed. She sits there like a patient guardian, waiting for someone with enough strength to help her continue her journey to wherever the dead are supposed to go. The bread queue has developed its own grim etiquette around death. When someone collapses in line, the people around them check for signs of life with the professional efficiency of medical examiners. If the person is still breathing, they are helped to sit down and offered sips of hot water from thermoses that never seem quite hot enough. If they're not breathing, they're covered with coats or blankets and moved to the side, and the line continues. The bread distribution doesn't stop. For death, it can't, because stopping means everyone else gets a little closer to joining the person under the blanket. Your body has entered what you think of as the conservation phase. Everything that isn't absolutely essential has been shut down or reduced to minimum power. Your hair stopped growing weeks ago. Your fingernails have become brittle and strange. Your menstrual cycle, if you're a woman, stopped back in December, as if your body has decided that reproduction is too expensive a luxury for these times. Even your thoughts move more slowly, like a computer running too many programs on insufficient memory. The strange thing is how normal death has become. Not welcome, not casual, but normal in the way that rain or snow is normal, an environmental condition to be navigated rather than prevented. Children step around bodies on their way to school without breaking stride. Workers plan their routes to avoid streets where too many people have collapsed, not from squeamishness, but from efficiency. Death has become part of the city's weather. At the hospital, you went there last week when your neighbour Pavel collapsed in the hallway. The doctors have developed a kind of triage system, based on realistic expectations rather than medical idealism. They divide patients into 3 categories: those who might recover with treatment, those who might recover without treatment, and those who won't recover regardless. The 3rd category receives comfort care and warm blankets, but the scarce medicines go to the first 2 groups. It's brutal mathematics, but it's the only mathematics that makes sense when resources are finite and death is infinite. Your dreams have evolved beyond food fantasies into elaborate visions of warmth. You dream of summer days so hot you can't bear to wear a sweater, of fires so large you have to step back from them, of hot baths where the water actually steams. You wake from these dreams, and for a moment can't understand why you're so cold, why your breath is visible in your bedroom, why your feet have gone numb inside 3 pairs of socks. The city's cats and dogs disappeared months ago. Not all at once, but gradually, the way snow melts in spring. Nobody talks about where they went, but everyone understands. When you're dying of starvation, sentiment becomes a luxury you can't afford. The pigeons vanished next, then the rats, and finally even the crows. Leningrad has become a city scrubbed clean of anything that might have provided protein, leaving only humans and the occasional seagull that flies in from the Gulf of Finland. Your work has been reduced to the most essential functions, and those functions have been redefined in ways that would have seemed insane 6 months ago. The city library now operates as a fuel distribution centre, burning books nobody checks out anymore to heat the reading rooms where people come not to read, but to sit somewhere warmer than their apartments. The museums have become storage, facilities for the possessions of people who no longer need possessions. The schools still open, but they're mostly refugee centres where children and elderly people huddle together for warmth. You've developed a new relationship with time. Days blur together into a single, continuous experience of cold and hunger, punctuated by the brief warmth of eating your daily bread ration. You measure time not by clocks but by the intervals between food, between sleep, between moments when you feel strong enough to move. Yesterday and tomorrow have become abstract concepts. There is only now, and now is always cold and always hungry. The radio still broadcasts, though the messages have become increasingly surreal. Announcements about spring planting when the ground is still frozen solid. Updates about increased production at factories that haven't operated in weeks. Patriotic songs about the glorious struggle while people die quietly in doorways. It's like listening to transmissions from another planet, where words still mean what they used to mean. But here's the remarkable thing, people are still people. In the bread queue, strangers share body heat by standing close together. Neighbours check on each other with the dedication of family members. Teachers still arrive at schools to provide whatever education they can to whatever children show up. Doctors still report to hospitals even when they're too weak to walk steadily. The human capacity for maintaining civilization, while everything civilized falls apart, turns out to be nearly infinite. Tonight, as you prepare for another night in your frozen apartment, you realize that you've become part of something unprecedented. A city learning to die with dignity. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, persistently, one day at a time. And somehow, against all logic and expectation, you're still here. Still breathing, still thinking, still planning to wake up tomorrow and walk to the bread queue and continue this impossible experiment in human endurance. The truly amazing thing is that you're not ready to give up yet. You wake up in November, and your pillow is now a hardcover copy of War and Peace, which has become less literary irony and more practical comfort since it's the thickest book you own. Outside your frosted window, Lake Ladoga has finally frozen solid. That vast inland sea that stretches beyond the horizon like a promise that geography made to hope. The ice is thick enough now to support trucks, which means the road of life is officially open. Though calling it a road is like calling hunger a diet plan. The temperature outside reads -35°C, cold enough to freeze spit before it hits the ground, cold enough to make breathing feel like swallowing glass. But this killing cold is also salvation. It's the only thing standing between Leningrad and complete isolation. The ice on Lake Ladoga has become your city's lifeline, a frozen highway across 20 miles of what was open water just weeks ago. Your morning routine now includes listening for the rumble of truck engines on the ice road. When the wind is right, you can hear them from your apartment, a low, constant growling that sounds like mechanical hope. Each truck carries about 2 tons of supplies, mostly flour, but sometimes sugar, sometimes canned meat, sometimes medicines that expired months ago but are still better than nothing. The math is simple and terrible. 3 million people need about 3,000 tons of food per day to survive. The ice road can maybe deliver 300 tons on a good day. The bread ration increased yesterday, not by much, but enough to notice. From 125 grams to 200 grams, which feels like abundance after months of slow starvation. The bread is still more sawdust than wheat, still tastes like cardboard seasoned with despair, but there's more of it. You cut your portion into 8 pieces instead of 6, and eat them over the course of 12 hours, making each bite a small celebration. Mrs. Petrov from the 5th floor has a son driving trucks on the ice road. She shows everyone his latest letter, written on paper so thin you can see through it. The ice sings, he writes, like a whale calling across the ocean. Sometimes you can hear it cracking below the wheels, but it holds. Always holds. He doesn't mention the trucks that disappear through weak spots in the ice, the drivers who freeze to death when their engines fail, the cargo that gets lost when supply convoys lose their way in blizzards. Mrs. Petrov reads between the lines and pretends she doesn't understand what the silences mean. You've volunteered to help unload supply trucks at the distribution centre, partly from civic duty, but mostly because volunteers sometimes receive extra rations. The work is exhausting as each sack of flour weighs 50 kilograms, which is nearly as much as you do now, but it's also hopeful. Real food, arriving from the outside world, proof that Leningrad hasn't been completely forgotten by the universe. The truck drivers are heroes in the most literal sense, though they'd laugh if you called them that. They're mostly young men and women who navigate 20 miles of frozen lake in vehicles that weren't designed for Arctic conditions, following compass bearings and prayer when the snow gets too thick to see landmarks. They drive without headlights to avoid attracting German bombers, which means navigating by feel and instinct and the way ice responds to weight. Each trip across the lake is a gamble with death. The ice is never uniformly thick. There are spots where springs keep it thin, places where the wind has created pressure ridges, areas where yesterday's solid surface becomes today's death trap. The drivers develop an almost supernatural ability to read the ice, listening to the sounds their trucks make as they drive, feeling for the subtle vibrations that mean the difference between safe passage and a plunge into black water. At the supply depot, you meet Eleanor, a 22-year-old truck driver who's been making the crossing for 6 weeks. Her hands are permanently stained with oil, and her face has the deep tan that comes from reflected sunlight off snow, but her eyes are older than her years. She tells you about the night her convoy got lost in a blizzard and drove in circles for 8 hours before finding the correct route. "We burned half our fuel just staying alive," she says, "but the flour made it through. That's what matters." The supply trucks don't just bring food, they also take people out. Evacuees, mostly children and the elderly, packed into the back of cargo trucks for the bone-jarring journey across the frozen lake. The evacuation is voluntary in theory, mandatory in practice for anyone the city decides it can't afford to feed. Families are separated based on brutal calculations: who's most likely to survive, who contributes most to the war effort, who takes up the least resources. You watch the evacuation trucks load up with the kind of desperate efficiency that saves lives and breaks hearts simultaneously. Children as young as 5, bundled in every piece of clothing their families can spare, are lifted into truck beds lined with straw and blankets. They don't cry. Tears freeze too quickly at these temperatures, but their eyes hold a kind of understanding that no child should possess. They know they might never see their parents again, and they know this might be their only chance at survival. The trucks carrying evacuees out are the same trucks that bring supplies in, which creates a grim symmetry. Food arrives, people leave, the city slowly empties itself to match its reduced capacity to sustain life. It's triage on a metropolitan scale, choosing who lives and who dies based on calculations no human should have to make. The German Air Force knows about the ice road, of course, and sends bombers whenever the weather permits. The Luftwaffe pilots have learned to time their attacks for maximum psychological impact, just as convoys are halfway across the lake, too far from either shore to reach safety quickly. Some trucks make it through the bombing runs, some don't, and some disappear so completely that nobody knows whether they were hit by bombs or simply broke through weak ice. At night, lying in your frozen apartment, you can sometimes hear the ice road calling. Not literally, you're hungry, not crazy, but there's something in the wind that carries the sound of engines, the groan of ice under pressure, the whispered prayers of drivers who know they're one wrong turn away from joining the lake's collection of frozen trucks and their contents. The road of life is badly named. It's more like the road of slim chances, the road of maybe tomorrow, the road of we'll see how this goes. But it's the only road you have, a 20-mile ribbon of ice across dark water, carrying just enough hope to keep 3 million people alive for another day, another week, another month of impossible survival, and somehow incredibly it works. Not well, not reliably, not without terrible cost, but it works. Every morning brings new trucks, new supplies, new proof that the outside world remembers you exist. The ice holds, the drivers keep driving, and Leningrad continues its slow-motion dance with death, one frozen mile at a time. You wake up in December, and your pillow is now a philosophy textbook wrapped in a wool scarf that belonged to Mrs. Kozlova. The irony isn't lost on you, spending your nights with Kant and Hegel while your days are consumed by the very unphilosophical business of not dying. Outside, the temperature has dropped to -40, which is cold enough to make the air itself seem solid, cold enough to turn your apartment into a walk-in freezer with a bed in it. The bread ration has stabilized at 250 grams, which feels like prosperity after months of slow starvation. The bread is still approximately 15% sawdust, 10% flour substitute made from cottonseed cake, and the rest are a mystery that tastes like industrial accident. But there's more of it. You've learned to toast your daily portion over candle flames, which doesn't improve the flavour but creates the illusion of a proper meal. Sometimes illusions are all you have. At the supply depot, you've become part of an intricate system that operates with the precision of Swiss clockwork and the desperation of people who understand that mistakes kill entire families. Every gram of flour is accounted for, every sack of grain is weighed twice, every shipment is distributed according to calculations that factor in age, occupation, health status, and mathematical formulas that reduce human beings to caloric requirements. The depot manager, A thin woman named Katerina, who speaks in numbers the way other people speak in emotions, shows you the charts that govern your city's survival. "We need 2,100 tons of food per day," she explains, pointing to columns of figures that look like hieroglyphics but actually represent life and death. "On good days, we receive 400 tons. On bad days, 50. On very bad days," she doesn't finish the sentence. Mathematics has its own grammar of despair. The supply system operates on 3 levels of truth. The official truth, broadcast on radio and published in newspapers, claims that food deliveries are adequate and increasing. The practical truth, known to anyone involved in distribution, is that supplies remain critically short and dependent on weather, ice conditions, and German bombing schedules. The real truth, spoken only in whispers among people who understand the full scope of the crisis, is that Leningrad is losing a race between starvation and salvation, and the outcome remains uncertain. You've been assigned to help sort incoming supplies by category and quality. The flour ranges from almost actual wheat to substances that might charitably be called grain adjacent. The canned goods include pre-war delicacies that taste like memories of better times, wartime rations that taste like patriotic duty, and mysterious preserves from allied countries that taste like charitable thoughts translated into food. Each category gets distributed according to different formulas. The elderly receive the most digestible items, workers get the highest calorie options, and children receive whatever provides the most nutrition per gram. The warehouse operates 24 hours a day, lit by candles since electric power is reserved for essential services, which apparently doesn't include preventing your volunteers from walking into walls. You work 4-hour shifts because longer periods become dangerous. People collapse from exhaustion, make mistakes that cost lives, or simply forget what they're doing mid-task as their brains shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy. Elena, the truck driver you met last month, has been promoted to convoy leader after her predecessor's truck broke through thin ice near the eastern shore. She's 23 now, birthdays still happen even when everything else stops, and has developed the kind of calm competence that comes from daily proximity to death. The secret, she tells you while loading her truck with sacks of flour, is to drive like you're carrying eggs instead of food, but think like you're carrying dynamite. The convoy schedules depend on weather forecasts that are more art than science, ice reports that are more hope than fact, and German bombing patterns that change without notice. Elena shows you her route map, marked with notes in different colours: blue for safe passages, yellow for questionable ice, red for known danger zones, and black for areas where trucks have simply disappeared without explanation. The map looks like an abstract painting, if abstract painters specialised in mortality statistics. The evacuees waiting for transport out of the city represent the most heartbreaking arithmetic of all. Each truck can carry either 2 tons of food or 40 people, which means every evacuation convoy represents 80,000 grams of food that won't reach the city. The officials making these decisions have to calculate whether saving 40 lives today is worth risking 400 lives tomorrow. There's no right answer, which is why the decisions get made by committee, and the committee members look older every week. You meet families being separated by these calculations. Parents deemed too weak to work are evacuated while their teenage children stay behind because they can still contribute to the war effort. Elderly grandparents are loaded onto trucks while their adult children remain because someone needs to maintain the infrastructure. Children are sent away while their mothers stay because someone needs to distribute the food that might keep everyone else alive for another week. The logistics are almost impossible to comprehend. Every decision creates cascading effects that ripple through the entire system. Evacuating a baker means less bread for everyone. Keeping a doctor means 1 less evacuation slot for a child. Sending out a truck full of people means 1 less supply run. The mathematics of survival have no good answers, only necessary ones. At night, you listen to the radio broadcasts from Moscow that paint increasingly optimistic pictures of the siege situation. According to official sources, food supplies are adequate, morale remains high, and the heroic people of Leningrad are successfully defending the cradle of the revolution. These broadcasts would be funny if you had the energy to laugh. Instead, you listen with the detached interest of someone overhearing conversations about strangers in a foreign country. Your diary entries have become purely statistical. Day 237, bread ration 250 go, temperature 38°C, 3 supply trucks arrived, Mrs. Volkov evacuated, Pavel died. These numbers tell the story of your city better than any narrative could. The statistics are their own poetry, a mathematics of endurance written in grams and degrees, and the simple arithmetic of who's still breathing. The strangest thing about the supply system is how it creates hope and despair simultaneously. Every truck that arrives proves that the outside world hasn't forgotten you, but also reminds you how precarious your survival remains. Every successful evacuation saves lives while acknowledging that the city can't support everyone who lives here. Every bag of flour extends your collective existence while highlighting how close you all remain to the edge of complete collapse. But the system works, after a fashion. Not well, not efficiently, not without terrible choices and heartbreaking losses, but it works. The ice road holds, the trucks keep running, the supplies keep arriving, and Leningrad continues its slow-motion negotiation with death. 3 million people learning to survive on hope and mathematics and the thin ice that separates them from the dark water below. You wake up in January and your pillow is now a collection of love letters from the 1920s that you found in Mrs. Kozlova's empty apartment. The letters smell like old perfume and older dreams, and they remind you that people once had the luxury of writing about romance instead of survival. Outside, the temperature has reached -42, cold enough to make steel brittle, cold enough to turn breath into ice crystals that tinkle like wind chimes when they fall to the ground. The bread ration increased again yesterday, to 300 grams for workers, 200 for everyone else, which feels like abundance after months of careful rationing. More importantly, the bread now contains actual wheat flour mixed with the sawdust and cellulose, which means it tastes like food attempting to remember what food used to taste like. Progress is measured in small improvements to terrible situations. Elena stops by the supply depot with the news that changes everything. The ice road has been upgraded. Not just single trucks making desperate runs across questionable ice, but actual infrastructure. The engineers have surveyed the safest routes, marked them with pine branches stuck into the ice every 100 meters, and established way stations where drivers can warm up and repair vehicles. What started as a desperate improvisation has become a functioning supply line. We're moving 500 tons per day now, Elena tells you, her face showing the kind of cautious optimism that's been extinct in Leningrad for months. Sometimes more when the weather cooperates. The Americans sent us trucks designed for cold weather, Studebakers that start in -40 temperatures. The British are sending canned meat that actually contains meat. She pauses, then adds with the first smile you've seen in weeks. I ate a piece of chocolate yesterday, real chocolate, tasted like civilization. The supply depot has expanded to handle the increased flow of goods. New warehouses have been built, or rather, existing buildings have been converted by knocking holes in walls and installing loading docks that work in Arctic conditions. The staff has grown from a handful of desperate volunteers to an actual workforce with shift schedules, job descriptions, and something approaching professional efficiency. You've been promoted from volunteer to assistant supply coordinator, which sounds more important than it is, but comes with additional food rations that make the difference between slow starvation and actual survival. Your job involves matching incoming supplies with the Timmins with outgoing distribution requests, which means you spend your days juggling numbers that represent the difference between life and death for thousands of people. It's the most important mathematics you've ever done. The distribution system has evolved beyond simple ration cards to accommodate different types of supplies and different levels of need. Factory workers receive extra portions of high-energy foods. Hospital staff get priority access to medicines and vitamins. Children and pregnant women receive whatever milk and eggs make it through the supply line. The elderly get priority for easily digestible items. It's triage on a citywide scale, but it's organised triage with procedures and protocols instead of desperate improvisation. At the warehouse, you meet people who've become legends in the small world of Leningrad logistics. There's Boris, a former circus performer who can stack supply crates with geometric precision and unload a truck faster than teams of ordinary workers. There's Maria, a mathematics professor who's developed distribution algorithms that ensure supplies reach the most people in the most efficient way possible. There's Ivan, a 12-year-old who's memorized the locations of every supply depot in the city and serves as a human GPS system for drivers who get lost in the maze of snow-covered streets. The evacuations have become more systematic. 2. Instead of desperate families making individual decisions about who stays and who goes, there are now organised convoys with medical screening, proper supplies for the journey, and coordination with reception centres on the other side of the lake. The separation is still heartbreaking, but it's heartbreaking with paperwork and procedures that ensure evacuees have the best possible chance of survival. You help process evacuation applications, which means reading stories that would break your heart if you had the emotional energy for heartbreak. A mother requesting evacuation for her 3 children while she stays behind to work in a munitions factory. An elderly couple asking to be evacuated together because they can't imagine surviving separately. A teenage boy volunteering to stay behind so his younger sister can take his evacuation slot. Each application represents a family's worst possible decision presented as their best possible choice. The psychological effect of improved supplies extends far beyond simple nutrition. People walk straighter, speak louder, smile more often. The bread queues have become social gatherings where neighbours share news and gossip instead of standing in silent desperation. Children have started playing games that require energy instead of just sitting quietly. The city is remembering how to be alive instead of just existing. But the improvements remain fragile, dependent on weather conditions that can change without warning, and German bombing schedules that follow no predictable pattern. A warm spell that weakens the ice can shut down the supply line for days. A successful bombing run can destroy weeks' worth of supplies in minutes. The balance between survival and catastrophe remains measured in tons per day and degrees below zero. The radio broadcasts have become more realistic, acknowledging hardships while celebrating improvements. Instead of claiming that everything is fine, they now admit that things were terrible but are getting better. It's a subtle shift, but it represents a kind of honesty that makes the improvements feel more real and sustainable. Hope backed by evidence is more powerful than hope based on wishful thinking. Your diary entries have become more complex, reflecting a life that includes possibilities beyond simple survival. Day 267. Bread ration, 300 gur, chocolate. Helped evacuate Petrov family. Heartbreaking but necessary. Elena says ice road will stay open through March. Maybe we'll make it. These entries document not just survival, but the gradual return of something that might eventually become normal life. At night, lying in your still cold but no longer freezing apartment, you can hear the ice road humming with constant traffic. Trucks heading out loaded with evacuees, trucks heading back loaded with supplies, the steady rhythm of a city that's learned to breathe again. The sound isn't beautiful exactly, but it's hopeful. The mechanical heartbeat of a place that's decided to keep living despite everything. The road of life has earned its name, not because it makes life easy, but because it makes life possible. Every truck that crosses represents another day of survival, another small victory against the mathematics of starvation. The ice holds, the supplies flow, and Leningrad continues its slow emergence from the valley of the shadow of death, one frozen mile at a time. You wake up in April, and your pillow is now a collection of technical manuals about steam engines, which represent optimism since they assume a future where things might need to be built rather than just salvaged. Outside your window, something miraculous is happening. The ice on your apartment walls is melting, leaving trails of water that catch the morning light like tears of relief. The temperature has climbed to -5 Celsius, which feels tropical after months of Arctic survival. Spring in Leningrad arrives not as a celebration, but as a cautious negotiation between hope and experience. The snow is melting in patches, revealing a city that looks like an archaeological dig of winter survival. Piles of debris emerge from snowdrifts, pieces of furniture burned for fuel, abandoned possessions too heavy to carry, and other objects you try not to identify too closely. The city is molting, shedding the detritus of its winter transformation. The bread ration has stabilised at 400 grams for workers, 300 for everyone else, which represents something approaching adequacy if not abundance. More importantly, the bread now tastes recognisably like bread, with actual wheat comprising maybe 60% of the mixture instead of the 20% you grew accustomed to during the worst months. You can eat your daily portion in normal bites instead of the microscopic ones, which feels like luxury beyond description. At the supply depot, the atmosphere has shifted from desperate crisis management to something approaching routine efficiency. The warehouse operates with regular schedules, proper inventory systems, and enough supplies to plan more than one day ahead. Elena, now promoted to logistics coordinator, shows you charts that track deliveries over the past month. Steady increases in tonnage, more reliable scheduling, fewer trips lost to bombing or ice conditions. We're moving 800 tons per day on average, she tells you, pointing to numbers that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. The Americans have started sending us spam, processed meat in cans. It tastes like salty happiness mixed with patriotic duty. The British are providing dried milk that actually reconstitutes into something resembling milk, and the Soviets have finally figured out how to get fresh vegetables through the supply line. The first fresh vegetables in 7 months arrive on a Tuesday morning in a truck that has been converted into a mobile greenhouse. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and even some leafy greens that survive the journey from farms hundreds of miles away. You hold a carrot in your hand and stare at it like it's a religious artifact, which in some ways it is. Proof that the world beyond Leningrad still grows things instead of just destroying them. The distribution of fresh vegetables creates a kind of holiday atmosphere in the bread queues. People who haven't smiled in months discover that their faces still remember how to express joy. Children who have forgotten what colours other than grey and white look like stare at orange carrots and green lettuce leaves with the wonder of explorers discovering new continents. Mrs. Petrov, who lost 30 kilograms over the winter, cries when she receives 2 potatoes and a small onion. Your job has evolved from survival logistics to something approaching normal supply chain management. Instead of calculating how to distribute starvation rations equitably, you're now planning menus that include multiple food groups and considering dietary requirements beyond basic caloric needs. It's still challenging work, supplies remain limited, and demand exceeds availability, but it's challenging like running a business instead of challenging like preventing mass death. The evacuations continue, but they've changed character completely. Instead of desperate families fleeing a dying city, they're now planned relocations of people who can rebuild their lives elsewhere while reducing the burden on Leningrad's resources. The evacuation trucks carry people who wave goodbye instead of staring with hollow eyes. Children being evacuated now bring toys and books instead of just the clothes on their backs. You help process an evacuation request from the Volkov family. Mother, father, 2 children, an elderly grandmother. They're not leaving because they're dying, but because they've been offered work at a factory in the Urals that needs their specific skills. The father is a precision machinist, the mother is a chemical engineer, and they represent the kind of educated workforce that other cities desperately need. Their evacuation is an investment in the future rather than a last resort. The city's infrastructure is slowly returning to life. Water pressure has been restored to most buildings, though the water still tastes like metal and needs to be boiled before drinking. Electricity operates on predictable schedules instead of random availability. 4 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the evening, enough to power essential services and provide some comfort for residents. The radio broadcasts all day instead of just during evening hours. But spring also reveals the true cost of winter survival. As snow melts and debris is cleared, the city discovers just how many of its residents didn't make it through the siege. Bodies emerge from snowdrifts like flowers blooming in reverse. The official death toll climbs daily as workers systematically search through buildings, courtyards, and abandoned areas. The numbers are staggering. Somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million people, though exact counts become meaningless at that scale. The psychological impact of spring combines relief with grief in proportions that change daily. You're grateful to be alive, but the gratitude is mixed with guilt about surviving when so many others didn't. You're hopeful about the future, but the hope is tempered by memories of how quickly everything good can disappear. You're stronger than you were in February, but you're also more fragile in ways that have nothing to do with physical health. Your dreams have evolved beyond food fantasies to include visions of normal life. Walking through parks without watching for bodies, buying groceries from stores with full shelves, heating your apartment to comfortable temperatures. These dreams feel simultaneously attainable and impossible, like winning a lottery where the prize is everything you used to take for granted. The radio broadcasts have begun mentioning plans for post-war reconstruction, which represents a kind of optimism that was unthinkable during the worst months. Officials discuss rebuilding damaged infrastructure, establishing new cultural institutions, and creating memorials to honour those who died during the siege. The future tense has returned to public discourse, which might be the most significant improvement of all. At night, lying in your apartment that's now merely cold instead of freezing, you can hear the city breathing differently. The sounds of spring, melting ice, running water, wind that doesn't howl with murderous intent, mix with the sounds of human activity. People talking in the courtyards, children playing in the streets, workers rebuilding what winter destroyed. It's the sound of a city remembering how to live instead of just surviving. Spring in Leningrad is a season of cautious hope, measured optimism, and the gradual return of possibilities that seemed permanently lost. Not full recovery, that will take years if it ever comes, but the beginning of recovery. The ice is melting, the supplies are flowing, and you're still alive to see another season change. That might not be everything, but it's enough to build on. You wake up in May, and your pillow is now a collection of poetry books, Pushkin, Akhmatova, Bloch, because you've rediscovered that humans need beauty as well as bread. Outside, genuine spring has finally arrived with temperatures above freezing, sunshine that actually provides warmth, and the first green shoots pushing through the soil in the courtyard garden. The city is attempting to remember what life looked like before survival became a full-time occupation. The bread ration has increased to 500 grams for workers, 400 for everyone else, and the bread now contains the ingredients that actually belong in bread: wheat flour, yeast, salt, and only a minimal amounts of sawdust for texture. You can eat your daily portion like a normal person instead of a desperate survivor, spreading it with margarine that sometimes arrives in the supply shipments and occasionally even jam made from berries that grow somewhere beyond the siege perimeter. At the supply depot, Elena shows you the latest inventory reports with something approaching satisfaction. We're receiving over 1,000 tons per day now, she says, pointing to charts that track consistent improvement over the past 6 weeks. The ice road is operating like an actual highway instead of a desperate gamble. We have enough food in storage to survive interruptions in supply. We might actually be winning this race between starvation and salvation. The supply system has evolved beyond crisis management into something resembling normal logistics. Warehouses maintain stock levels instead of just moving supplies as quickly as possible. Distribution centres operate with regular hours and predictable procedures. The staff has grown to include specialists, nutritionists who design balanced meal plans, engineers who maintain transportation equipment, and administrators who track supplies with the kind of detailed record-keeping that belongs to peacetime bureaucracy. You've been assigned to manage the fresh food distribution program, which represents a kind of miracle you couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. Trucks now arrive regularly with vegetables, dairy products, and even occasional meat that hasn't been processed into unrecognizable paste. Children receive milk that comes from actual cows instead of powder mixed with hope. Elderly residents get soft foods that their surviving teeth can actually chew. Pregnant women receive supplements that might help their babies develop properly despite everything. But abundance creates new challenges that scarcity made irrelevant. With more food available, people begin to notice quality differences in ways they couldn't when any food meant survival. Workers complain that their potatoes are smaller than expected. Families request specific vegetables for cultural or religious dietary requirements. Children refuse to eat items they consider disgusting, which is a luxury only possible when starvation isn't immediate. The evacuations continue, but they've transformed from desperate escapes to planned relocations that consider family preferences, professional opportunities, and personal connections. The Mikhailov family chooses evacuation to Kazan because Mrs. Mikhailova's sister lives there and can help them establish new lives. The Petrov children are evacuated to a collective farm where they can attend school while contributing to agricultural work. The separations remain painful, but they're painful with hope instead of despair. You help coordinate a reunion program that attempts to reconnect families separated during the worst months of the siege. Children evacuated in panic are matched with parents who survived. Elderly relatives who disappeared during the winter are located in hospitals or care facilities. Workers transferred to essential jobs in other districts are reunited, with families who thought they were dead. These reunions create joy and heartbreak in equal measure, the happiness of rediscovered love mixed with the grief of time lost forever. The city's infrastructure continues its slow recovery. Buildings have heat that operates on schedules instead of luck. Water flows from taps without requiring pilgrimages to communal wells. Electricity powers lights strong enough to read by instead of just prevent complete darkness. The radio broadcasts entertainment programming music, poetry readings, educational talks, instead of just news and propaganda. Normal life creeps back in small increments. But spring also reveals the psychological scars that winter carved into everyone who survived. People hoard food compulsively, unable to believe that supplies will continue arriving. Neighbours remain suspicious of each other, wondering who survived by taking from others. Children play games that revolve around finding food and hiding from danger. Adults jump at sudden noises and scan crowds for signs of threat or opportunity. Your dreams have become more complex, mixing hope with trauma in ways that create strange emotional landscapes. You dream of abundant meals served in warm rooms, but the food sometimes transforms into sawdust in your mouth. You dream of reunions with friends who died during the winter and wake up confused about whether they're alive or dead. You dream of summer heat so intense you need to remove your coat, then wake up checking to make sure your extra clothing is still within reach. The government has begun acknowledging the siege's true cost, publishing statistics that were classified during the worst months. The official death toll approaches 1 million people, though everyone understands that exact numbers are impossible when so many bodies were buried in mass graves or lost entirely. The numbers are so large they become abstract, a mathematical concept rather than human tragedy. You knew Mrs. Kozlova, Pavel, and dozens of others personally, but 1 million deaths is beyond personal comprehension. Memorial services begin appearing throughout the city, though they're complicated by uncertainty about who died when and where. Some families hold services for relatives they assume died, but whose bodies were never found. Others discover that relatives they mourned as dead actually survived and were evacuated to distant cities. The boundary between grief and hope becomes blurred when death and absence are indistinguishable. The radio begins broadcasting programs dedicated to remembering those who died during the siege, sharing stories about ordinary people who displayed extraordinary courage, kindness, and dignity during the worst circumstances imaginable. These programs serve as informal funerals for the city's collective losses, allowing survivors to grieve publicly for neighbours whose names nobody recorded and deaths nobody witnessed. Your diary entries now include reflections on survivals, guilt, the psychological burden of living when so many others died. Day 312, bread ration 500 griz, sunny weather, Mrs. Volkov's apartment still empty. Why did I survive when she didn't? What makes my life more valuable than hers? These questions have no answers, but writing them down makes them easier to carry. At night, lying in your apartment that's now genuinely warm instead of just not freezing, you listen to the sounds of a city that's learning to live again. Conversations in the courtyard that aren't about food or fuel. Children playing games that don't involve survival scenarios. Music from radios and gramophones that people are brave enough to use now that they're not conserving every bit of energy for basic existence. Spring in Leningrad is a season of recovery complicated by memory, hope shadowed by loss, and the gradual return of humanity to people who spent months learning to be something else. The city is healing, but it's healing around scars that will never completely disappear. The breadlines are shorter, the death rate is falling, and the future exists again. But the ghosts of winter remain, fed by guilt and gratitude in equal measure. You wake up in June, and your pillow is now a collection of gardening manuals because the city has decided to grow food instead of just receiving it. Outside your window, the courtyard garden that was buried under snow for 7 months is showing its first tentative signs of life. Not just weeds and wild growth, but actual planted vegetables that residents have started cultivating in every available patch of soil. The sight of green tomato plants and emerging potato shoots feels like a small revolution against despair. The temperature reaches 15 degrees Celsius on good days, which feels tropical after a winter that nearly killed everyone who lived through it. You can walk outside without wrapping yourself in every piece of clothing you own. You can breathe without feeling like you're inhaling glass. Most remarkably, you can think about things other than immediate survival. Luxury thoughts like what to plant in your small garden plot and whether your tomatoes will ripen before the next winter arrives. The bread ration has stabilized at 600 grams for workers, 500 for everyone else, and the bread tastes like actual bread, instead of an approximation of bread made from construction materials. More significantly, bread is no longer the only food available. The supply system now delivers fresh vegetables, dairy products, eggs, and occasionally meat that hasn't been processed beyond recognition. Meals are becoming combinations of foods instead of single desperate items consumed with maximum efficiency. Elena has been promoted again, now serving as Regional Supply Coordinator with responsibility for multiple cities connected by the expanding network of supply routes. She shows you maps that illustrate the transformation of desperate improvisation into systematic infrastructure. The ice road has been supplemented by land routes, rail connections, and even some river transport during the brief summer months. Leningrad is no longer completely isolated. It's becoming part of a larger system designed for long-term sustainability rather than short-term survival. We're moving 2,000 tons per day now, she tells you, pointing to statistics that would have seemed fantastical during the worst months. But more importantly, we're moving the right kinds of supplies: fresh food, medical equipment, construction materials, even books and musical instruments. The city isn't just surviving anymore, it's starting to live again. Your role at the supply depot has evolved into something approximating normal peacetime work. Instead of calculating how to distribute starvation rations, you're now planning balanced nutrition programs that consider vitamins, minerals, and dietary variety. Children receive special meals designed to help them recover from malnutrition. Elderly residents get food selected for digestibility and nutritional density. Pregnant women receive supplements that might help them deliver healthy babies despite the trauma their bodies endured. The distribution system has become sophisticated enough to accommodate personal preferences and cultural requirements. Jewish families can request foods that comply with dietary restrictions. Vegetarians, a concept that seemed absurdly luxurious during the starvation months, can receive plant-based alternatives. Workers with physically demanding jobs get higher calorie allocations. It's not abundance, but it's choice, which represents a kind of freedom that hunger had eliminated. The evacuation program has transformed completely, shifting from emergency population reduction to voluntary relocation assistance. Families choose to leave because they see better opportunities elsewhere, not because staying means certain death. The city helps them relocate by providing transportation, temporary housing, and job placement assistance. Some families choose to stay, and that choice is respected rather than overruled by bureaucratic triage decisions. You help coordinate a program that assists families in reuniting across the expanded Soviet territory. Children evacuated to Central Asia are brought back to parents who survived the siege. Workers transferred to weapons factories in the Urals return to reunite with families they feared they'd never see again. Elderly relatives who disappeared during the chaos are located in hospitals and care facilities throughout the region. These reunions create complicated emotions: joy mixed with grief for time lost, love complicated by trauma, hope shadowed by uncertainty about the future. The city's physical infrastructure is being rebuilt with an efficiency that reflects hard-learned lessons about what's essential and what's merely convenient. Buildings are repaired with improved heating systems that actually function in extreme cold. Water pipes are installed with better insulation to prevent freezing. Electrical systems are designed with redundancy to maintain power during emergencies. The city is being rebuilt to survive, not just exist. But the most significant changes are psychological and social. People have begun making plans that extend beyond the next meal, the next day, the next week. Families discuss where children should attend school in the fall. Workers consider career changes and professional development. Young couples talk about marriage and starting families. The future tense has returned to daily conversation, which might be the most important recovery of all. The radio broadcasts include programming that would have seemed impossibly frivolous during the starvation months. Cooking shows that discuss recipes using ingredients people can actually obtain. Gardening advice for urban agriculture projects. Educational programs about literature and music and art. Culture is returning alongside calories, feeding parts of human nature that hunger had forced into hibernation. Your diary entries now include observations about beauty and hope alongside the continuing documentation of survival. Day 356. Bread ration 600 grus, tomatoes flowering in courtyard garden, children playing music in the street. Mrs. Petrov's grandson visited from Kazan, grew 10 centimeters and learned to read. Spring feels permanent today. The memorial services have evolved into community celebrations that honor both those who died and those who survived. These gatherings serve multiple functions: grieving the losses, celebrating the recovery, and building social bonds among neighbors who helped each other through the worst experience in the city's history. They're creating new traditions that acknowledge trauma while affirming life. Garden plots have appeared in every available space: courtyards, rooftops, vacant lots, and even small containers on windowsills. The city is learning to feed itself, reducing dependence on supply lines that remain vulnerable to disruption. These gardens produce food, but they also produce hope, tangible evidence that life can grow from ground that seemed permanently poisoned by hunger and death. The children who survived the siege represent both the city's greatest tragedy and its most significant hope. They are showing remarkable resilience, adapting to improved conditions with the flexibility that belongs to youth. They are attending school regularly, playing with energy, and displaying curiosity about subjects beyond survival. They are also carrying psychological scars that will influence their entire lives, but they're carrying those scars forward into futures that exist again. At night, lying in your apartment that's now genuinely comfortable instead of just habitable, you can hear the city breathing with something approaching normal rhythm. Conversations that include laughter, music from multiple sources, children playing games that don't involve survival scenarios. It's the sound of a city that has remembered how to hope, how to plan, how to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Summer in Leningrad is a season of cautious optimism, measured recovery, and the gradual return of possibilities that seemed permanently lost. The city is healing, but it's healing with full awareness of how quickly everything good can disappear. The gardens are growing, the future exists, and you're still alive to see another season change. That's not everything, but it's enough to build on, one seed at a time. You wake up in September, and your pillow is now a comfortable feather pillow you traded for at the expanded marketplace, not because you were desperate, but because you had surplus goods to exchange. Outside your window, the courtyard garden is producing actual vegetables that supplement your regular food supply, instead of replacing meals entirely. The city has not just survived another season change, it has planned for it, prepared for it, and approached it with resources instead of desperation. The temperature drops to 5 degrees Celsius on cool mornings, which would have terrified you a year ago, but now just means it's time to wear a sweater. Your apartment has reliable heating that operates on a schedule you can predict. You have enough warm clothing stored in your closet instead of wearing every piece simultaneously. Most remarkably, you can consider autumn weather as a normal seasonal transition instead of the beginning of another potential death sentence. The bread ration has become almost irrelevant as a survival measure, though it continues as a government program to ensure food security. You receive 700 grams of high-quality bread daily, plus access to a variety of other foods through the expanded distribution system. Meals now include multiple courses, the seasonal vegetables from local gardens, and occasionally even desserts made with real sugar. Eating has transformed from desperate fuel consumption back into something approaching pleasure. The supply depot has evolved into a sophisticated logistics centre that manages food distribution for the entire Leningrad region. Elena, now Director of Regional Supply Coordination, oversees a network that includes not just survival rations but complete nutritional programs designed to help the population recover from prolonged malnutrition. The depot operates with the efficiency of peacetime commerce while maintaining the institutional memory of what happens when supply systems fail. We're moving 3,000 tons per day now, Eleanor explains, showing you computerized tracking systems that monitor not just quantity but nutritional balance, dietary variety, and population health indicators. More importantly, we're building redundancy into every system. Multiple supply routes, distributed storage facilities, emergency reserves that could sustain the city for months. We're never going back to depending on a single ice road across a frozen lake. Your role has evolved into community nutrition coordination, helping neighborhoods develop sustainable food systems that combine government supplies with local production and community cooperation. Gardens and small farms have been established throughout the city, producing fresh vegetables, herbs, and even some grains. Cooperative kitchens allow neighbours to share cooking responsibilities and resources. The city is becoming more self-sufficient while maintaining connections to the broader supply network. The evacuation program has essentially ended, replaced by the voluntary relocation assistance for people who choose to move for personal or professional reasons. Some families remain scattered across the Soviet Union, having built new lives in places where they evacuated during the worst months. Others have returned to Leningrad to rebuild their connections to the city that shaped them. The choice belongs to individuals and families rather than bureaucratic necessity. You help coordinate a family reunification program that has become one of the most complex and rewarding aspects of post-siege recovery. Children who were evacuated as young as 5 or 6 are now returning as teenagers who barely remember the city they left. Parents who were separated by death or evacuation are reconnecting with children who grew up believing they were orphans. These reunions require careful preparation, counselling support, and realistic expectations about relationships that were interrupted by trauma. The psychological recovery has proven more complicated than the physical recovery. Most residents show signs of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though the term doesn't exist yet and the symptoms are simply considered normal responses to abnormal experiences. People continue to hoard food compulsively. Loud noises trigger panic responses. Children play games that revolve around survival scenarios. Adults maintain hypervigilance about potential threats to food security. But the city has also developed remarkable emotional resilience based on shared experience and mutual support. Neighbours who helped each other survive continue to maintain close relationships. Community organisations have formed around shared interests and mutual aid. Cultural activities have resumed with attendance levels that exceed pre-war participation. People seem hungry for beauty, music, literature and art in ways that go beyond normal cultural appetite. The memorial culture has evolved into permanent institutions that honour both individual and collective sacrifice. The Piskaryovskoye Cemetery has been developed into a memorial complex that serves as a focal point for remembering the siege's victims while celebrating the survivors' resilience. Schools include siege history in their curriculum, ensuring that younger generations understand what their parents and grandparents endured. The city's identity has been permanently shaped by the experience of collective survival. Your diary entries now include reflections on recovery, growth, and the strange mixture of gratitude and wariness that defines post-trauma existence. Day 456. Tomatoes ripe in garden. Children's choir performed at memorial service. Still wake up counting food supplies. Still feel guilty for surviving. Still amazed by ordinary abundance. Still planning for next winter like it might be our last. The radio programming has expanded to include not just news and practical information, but entertainment, education, and cultural enrichment. Music programs feature both classical and popular selections. Educational broadcasts cover topics from basic literacy to advanced technical training. Cultural programs explore literature, history, and arts with the enthusiasm of people rediscovering intellectual pleasure after months of focusing exclusively on physical survival. Economic life has resumed with modifications that reflect lessons learned during the siege. The city maintains strategic food reserves that could sustain the population for extended periods. Employment programs prioritize skills that contribute to local self-sufficiency. Trade relationships emphasize diversification to prevent dependence on single sources. The economy is being rebuilt with redundancy and resilience as primary values. The children represent both the city's greatest achievement and its most complex challenge. Those who survived the siege display remarkable resilience and maturity, but also carry psychological scars that influence their development in ways that won't be fully understood for years. Educational programs have been designed to help them catch up academically while addressing their unique emotional needs. They're growing up with an understanding of scarcity and mortality that most children never acquire, which makes them both wiser and more anxious than typical young people. Social relationships have been permanently altered by the shared experience of extreme hardship. Marriages that survived the siege often display unusual strength and intimacy, having been tested under conditions that revealed essential character. Friendships formed during the worst months carry a depth that normal social relationships rarely achieve. Community bonds have been strengthened by mutual dependence and shared survival. At night, lying in your warm apartment with reliable heat and adequate food stored in your kitchen, you listen to a city that has learned to live with the knowledge that normal life is neither guaranteed nor permanent. The sounds include laughter and music and conversation, but also the subtle undertones of people who remain alert to potential threats, grateful for current abundance, and determined never to be caught unprepared again. Autumn in Leningrad is a season of complicated gratitude, measured celebration, and the ongoing negotiation between recovery and memory. The city has survived, but survival has changed everyone and everything in ways that will influence the future for generations. The harvest is good, the preparations for winter are adequate, and the future exists again. But the future exists with full awareness of how quickly everything can change, how fragile abundance really is, and how much strength people can discover when they have no other choice besides death. You wake up in November, and your pillow is the same comfortable feather pillow from September, but now you appreciate it differently, not as a luxury acquired through fortunate trade, but as a symbol of stability that continues from one day to the next. Outside, the first snow of the season falls gently rather than threateningly, coating the courtyard in white that looks beautiful instead of ominous. You watch it through windows that have proper curtains and adequate heating, observing winter's arrival from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The temperature drops to -10°C, and you respond by adjusting the thermostat in your apartment rather than burning furniture. You own warm clothing purchased through normal commerce rather than scavenged from abandoned apartments. Most significantly, you approach winter as a season to be managed with preparation and resources, rather than a siege to be survived through desperation and diminishing hope. Food has become so reliably available that you've begun taking it for granted again, which represents a kind of psychological recovery. Your kitchen contains ingredients for cooking rather than just rations for consumption. You plan meals based on preferences rather than availability. You occasionally waste small amounts of food without the crushing guilt that would have accompanied such waste during the starvation months. Normal wastefulness has returned as a luxury you can afford. At the supply depot, Elena shows you the annual planning documents that reflect how completely the logistics system has been transformed. Instead of day-to-day crisis management, the operation now works with seasonal forecasts, yearly budgets, and strategic planning that extends multiple years into the future. Emergency reserves have been calculated and stockpiled, multiple supply routes have been established and maintained. The city has built redundancy into every system that failed during the siege. We're not just feeding people anymore, Elena explains, reviewing charts that track nutritional recovery, population health indicators, and economic development metrics. We're building a food system that could withstand another siege if necessary, but more importantly one that supports actual prosperity instead of just survival. Children are growing at normal rates again, adults are regaining weight and strength, the city is getting healthier instead of just less sick. Your work has evolved into long-term community development, helping neighbourhoods establish sustainable food systems that will function independently of government support. Community gardens have expanded into cooperative farms. Neighbourhood kitchens have become social centres that strengthen community bonds while providing efficient food preparation. The city is developing local resilience while maintaining connections to broader supply networks. The family reunification program has become one of the most complex and emotionally demanding aspects of recovery work. Families separated during the siege are attempting to rebuild relationships disrupted by trauma, distance, and time. Children evacuated as young dependents are returning as independent teenagers with their own perspectives and preferences. Parents who survived by focusing entirely on their own existence are learning to be parents again to children who've grown up without them. You coordinate the case of the Volkov family, separated when 8-year-old Dmitry was evacuated to Kazakhstan while his parents remained in Leningrad. Dmitry, now 11, has returned speaking primarily Kazakh and carrying memories of a completely different childhood than the one he would have had in Leningrad. His parents spent 3 years grieving him as probably dead and learning to live without children. The reunion requires months of counselling, patience, and careful relationship rebuilding. The psychological recovery continues to reveal layers of complexity that weren't obvious during the immediate post-siege period. Survivors display what will eventually be recognised as classic symptoms of complex trauma: hypervigilance about food security, difficulty trusting that abundance will continue, compulsive saving behaviours, and persistent anxiety about future threats. But they also demonstrate remarkable resilience, community loyalty, and appreciation for ordinary pleasures that most people take for granted. The city's cultural life has not just resumed, but intensified, as if people are making up for time lost to pure survival. Concert halls operate at capacity with audiences that display unusual attention and appreciation. Libraries report unprecedented demand for books on subjects ranging from practical skills to pure entertainment. Art classes, music lessons, and theatre groups have waiting lists of adults who want to develop abilities they never had time to pursue during normal peacetime living. Memorial practices have evolved into permanent traditions that serve multiple psychological and social functions. Annual commemoration events help process collective grief while celebrating shared survival. Memorial sites provide focal points for individual mourning and community gathering. Educational programs ensure that younger generations understand the costs of the experience while appreciating the strength that emerged from it. Your diary entries now reflect the complex emotional landscape of post-trauma recovery. Day 520. First snow beautiful instead of terrifying. Helped Volkov family reunion. Challenging but hopeful. Still count food automatically. Still grateful for heat, light, abundance. Still wonder why I survived when others didn't. Still planning for next winter, but with confidence instead of desperation. The radio programming includes regular segments dedicated to Siege survivors sharing stories, advice, and perspectives on recovery. These programs serve therapeutic functions for speakers and listeners while creating a collective narrative about the experience and its ongoing influence. The broadcasts help normalize the psychological aftermath while validating the ongoing challenges of living with trauma memories. Economic development has resumed with particular emphasis on self-sufficiency and diversification. The city supports local food production, manufacturing, and services that reduce dependence on external supply lines. Trade relationships emphasize multiple partnerships rather than single-source dependence. Employment programs prioritize skills that contribute to community resilience. The economy is being rebuilt around lessons learned from near-total collapse. Educational systems have been modified to address the unique needs of children who experienced prolonged malnutrition, trauma, and disrupted schooling. Specialized programs help Siege survivors catch up academically while addressing emotional and psychological needs. Curriculum includes practical life skills, community cooperation, and resilience building alongside traditional academic subjects. The goal is creating citizens who are both educated and prepared for potential future challenges. Housing development emphasizes community spaces that encourage social connection and mutual support. Apartment buildings include common areas where neighbors can gather, share resources, and maintain the relationships that help them survive. Gardens and food storage areas are integrated into residential design. The physical environment is being shaped to support the social bonds that proved essential during the crisis. At night, lying in your warm, secure apartment with adequate food in your kitchen and reliable heat flowing through your radiators, you listen to a city that has learned to appreciate ordinary abundance while remaining alert to its fragility. The sounds include normal urban life, traffic, conversation, music, laughter, but also the subtle undertones of people who understand how quickly circumstances can change and how important community connections become when individual resources prove insufficient. Winter's return to Leningrad is no longer a death sentence to be endured, but a seasonal challenge to be managed with preparation, resources, and community support. The city has recovered not just its basic functions, but its capacity for growth, culture, and hope. But recovery carries the weight of memory, the responsibility of honouring those who didn't survive, and the determination to build a future worthy of the sacrifice that survival required. You wake up in January, and your pillow remains the same comfortable one, but the date holds significance that will never fade. Exactly 3 years since the siege began, 2 years since the worst starvation months, 1 year since genuine recovery started. Outside, winter snow falls on a city that has learned to coexist with its ghosts, building a future that acknowledges the past without being paralysed by it. The temperature reads -15 Celsius, which feels manageable rather than murderous, ordinary rather than apocalyptic. Your apartment has become a small museum of survival containing objects that represent different phases of the siege experience. The philosophy books that served as pillows now return to intellectual rather than purely physical function. The cooking pot that once boiled leather for protein, now used for normal food preparation. The radio that carried both propaganda and hope, now providing entertainment and education. These objects carry stories that will influence your relationship with material possessions for the rest of your life. Food has resumed its normal role as fuel and pleasure rather than the organising principle of existence, but your relationship with eating has been permanently altered. You still catch yourself calculating caloric content and nutritional value automatically. You continue to clean your plate completely, unable to leave even small amounts of food uneaten. You maintain emergency supplies that rational assessment would consider excessive, but psychological necessity demands. Normal abundance coexists with persistent awareness of its potential fragility. At the supply depot, Elena has been promoted to regional director, overseeing food security for multiple cities throughout the Northwest Soviet Union. Her office walls display maps, charts, and photographs that document the transformation from crisis improvisation to systematic resilience. The depot now serves as a model for other regions, demonstrating how supply systems can be designed to prevent and survive extreme disruptions. We've built something unprecedented, Elena explains, reviewing documentation that will inform emergency planning throughout the Soviet Union. A supply system that can shift between normal operations and crisis response without complete breakdown. Multiple redundant routes, distributed storage, community-level resilience, and institutional memory of what first. Like. Other cities are implementing similar systems based on what we learned here. Your work has evolved into trauma-informed community development, helping other regions prepare for potential disruptions while supporting ongoing recovery in Leningrad. The experience has created expertise that nobody wanted to acquire, but proves valuable for building resilient communities throughout the country. You travel to other cities, consulting on food security planning, community resilience building, and psychological recovery from collective trauma. The family reunification program has become a permanent institution, recognizing that siege-related separations created ongoing needs that extend far beyond the immediate post-war period. Some families successfully rebuild relationships disrupted by trauma and time. Others discover that separation created changes too profound to overcome completely. Most find middle ground, maintaining connections while acknowledging that shared experience created different people with different needs and perspectives. The Volkov family represents a successful but complex reunification. Dmitry has integrated his Kazakhstani childhood with his Leningrad heritage, becoming bilingual and bicultural in ways that enrich the entire family. His parents have learned to parent a child who experienced different trauma and developed different strengths. The family has created new traditions that honour both their pre-siege history and their separation experience while building shared future memories. The city's memorial culture has matured into institutions that serve both remembrance and education functions. The Siege Museum combines historical documentation with personal artefacts and survivor testimonies. Memorial sites throughout the city mark significant locations while serving as gathering places for ongoing community building. Educational programs ensure that younger generations understand the experience without being overwhelmed by its trauma. The psychological landscape of recovery continues revealing new layers of complexity. Survivors have developed what researchers will eventually term post-traumatic growth. Psychological strengths that emerge from successfully navigating extreme adversity. Increased appreciation for ordinary pleasures, deeper capacity for empathy, and mutual support, enhanced resilience in facing future challenges, and philosophical perspectives that prioritize essential values over superficial concerns. Your diary entries now reflect mature integration of trauma and recovery. Day 1095, 3 years since this began. Snow, peaceful instead of threatening. Help train emergency coordinators from Kiev. Still grateful for heat, food, safety, still miss neighbours who didn't make it. Still planning for contingencies, but with hope instead of desperation. Learning to live with ghosts while building for the living. The radio programming includes regular educational segments about siege history, survivor experiences, and lessons learned for future emergency preparedness. These programs serve multiple audiences, survivors processing ongoing recovery, younger generations learning from history, other communities preparing for potential challenges, and researchers documenting psychological and social responses to extreme adversity. Economic development has created a model for resilient urban systems that other cities study and adapt. Local food production capabilities, diversified manufacturing, distributed energy systems, and redundant transportation networks. The city maintains strategic reserves while avoiding the isolation that contributed to siege vulnerability. Trade relationships emphasize mutual support rather than simple resource extraction. Cultural life has not just resumed, but flourished with unusual intensity and community focus. Theatre productions explore themes of survival, resilience, and community solidarity. Musical performances draw audiences that display remarkable attention and appreciation. Literary works document siege experiences while creating new narratives about recovery and hope. Art serves both expression and healing functions for creators and audiences. Educational systems have been permanently modified to include community resilience, emergency preparedness, and psychological recovery as core curriculum elements alongside traditional academic subjects. Students learn practical skills for individual and community survival, while developing intellectual abilities and cultural appreciation. The goal is creating citizens who are both prepared for potential challenges and committed to preventing their recurrence. Housing development continues emphasizing community spaces and mutual support systems. New construction includes community kitchens, shared storage areas, and gathering spaces that encourage social connection. The physical environment supports the social bonds that proved essential during the crisis, while accommodating normal privacy and individual preferences during stable periods. At night, lying in your secure apartment with adequate heat and food, you listen to a city that has learned to live with its ghosts while building for the living. The sounds include ordinary urban life, traffic, conversation, music, laughter, but also the ongoing resonance of an experience that changed everyone and everything permanently, not just survival but transformation, not just recovery but growth, not just remembering the dead but honouring them through better living. The third anniversary of the siege marks not an ending, but a milestone in ongoing recovery and growth. The city has survived, rebuilt, and created something new. Not a return to pre-siege normalcy, but a different kind of community shaped by shared experience and mutual commitment to never letting it happen again. The ghosts remain, but they're no longer threats to the living. They've become teachers, guides, and reminders of both human fragility and human strength. Leningrad has learned to carry its ghosts gracefully, transforming trauma into wisdom, loss into appreciation, and survival into a foundation for hope. The future exists not despite the past, but because of it, built on lessons learned through suffering and strength discovered through necessity. Winter no longer threatens annihilation. It's simply another season in a city that has learned to plan for all seasons while living fully in each one. You wake up in September, 5 years after the siege ended, and your pillow is now just a pillow, comfortable, practical, purchased through normal commerce rather than desperate trade or improvisation. Outside your window, children who don't remember the starvation months play games in the courtyard where you once searched for frozen potato peels. These children were born after the siege or were too young to retain memories of systematic hunger, and their laughter carries a lightness that belongs to people who have never learned to hoard bread. Your apartment has evolved into a normal home rather than a survival shelter, but certain habits persist with the tenacity of psychological scar tissue. You still maintain food reserves that rational assessment would consider excessive. You still check the heating system daily during winter months. You still wake up some mornings briefly confused about what year it is, whether the bread rations have been announced, whether Mrs. Kozlova is still alive to knock on your door with her particular rhythm of concern and gossip. The supply depot has become a model for emergency preparedness throughout the Soviet Union, attracting delegations from other cities who want to understand how supply systems can be designed to prevent and survive extreme disruptions. Elena, now a Deputy Minister for Emergency Food Security, shows visitors through facilities that combine normal commercial operations with crisis response capabilities built on institutional memory of what absolute failure looks like. The children don't understand, Elena tells you during one of her visits to inspect the depot's educational programs. They see the stockpiles, the multiple supply routes, the emergency protocols, and it all seems like bureaucratic overcaution. They can't imagine what it was like when none of these systems existed, when survival depended on single ice roads across frozen lakes and hope that winter wouldn't last forever. Your work has shifted to developing educational programs that teach emergency preparedness and community resilience to younger generations who lack direct experience with supply system failure. The challenge is creating understanding without creating trauma, building awareness without generating paranoia, and honouring historical experience while encouraging optimism about the future. It's educational triage. How much reality can young minds absorb without being overwhelmed by possibilities they've never faced? The children who lived through the siege represent a unique population with characteristics that researchers are beginning to study and understand. Those who survived early childhood during the starvation months display unusual relationships with food, authority, and community solidarity. They are more likely to share resources automatically, more sensitive to signs of scarcity or abundance, and more appreciative of ordinary stability than children who experience normal developmental environments. Dmitry Volkov, now 16, serves as an unofficial ambassador between siege survivors and post-siege generations. His experience includes both Leningrad starvation and Kazakhstan evacuation, giving him perspectives that bridge different survival strategies and recovery experiences. He speaks at schools, youth organizations, and community events, helping younger children understand historical experience while demonstrating that trauma survivors can lead normal, successful lives. The hardest part, Dmitry explains to a group of 12-year-olds who were born after the siege ended, isn't remembering being hungry. It's helping people who were never hungry understand why we still count food, why we still check that doors are locked, why we still get nervous when supply trucks are late. We learned things you hope you never have to learn, but we also learned that people can survive things that seem impossible. The city's memorial culture has evolved to serve educational functions for younger generations while continuing to provide healing spaces for survivors. School groups visit memorial sites as part of curriculum requirements, learning about historical experience while developing empathy for their elders' ongoing recovery needs. These visits often represent children's first serious encounter with mortality, community vulnerability, and the proximity of disaster to ordinary life. But the memorials also demonstrate resilience, recovery, and the capacity for communities to transform extreme adversity into sources of strength and wisdom. Children learn not just about death and suffering, but about cooperation, mutual aid, and the human capacity to maintain dignity and compassion under circumstances that might have justified complete selfishness and despair. The family structures that emerged from siege experience continue influencing child development in ways that researchers are documenting for future reference. Children raised by siege survivors tend to display enhanced cooperation skills, increased sensitivity to community needs, and unusual appreciation for ordinary abundance. They're also more likely to experience anxiety about resource security and demonstrate compulsive saving behaviours that mirror their parents' adaptive responses to scarcity. Educational systems have been permanently modified to include community resilience and emergency preparedness, alongside traditional academic subjects. Children learn basic food preservation, community cooperation, and psychological coping skills, while developing literacy, mathematics, and cultural appreciation. The curriculum reflects understanding that education should prepare students for both normal prosperity and potential emergency situations. The psychological research emerging from siege survivor studies has begun influencing child development theory throughout the Soviet Union and beyond. The experience has demonstrated children's remarkable capacity for adaptation, while revealing the long-term psychological consequences of extreme adversity during crucial developmental periods. This research informs educational policy, mental health services, and emergency planning for other communities facing potential disruptions. Your diary entries now include reflections on intergenerational transmission of trauma and resilience. Day 1008-25. Children playing where we once searched for food. Dmitry spoke at school, handled difficult questions with remarkable maturity. Next generation learning from our experience without being overwhelmed by it. Building future that honours past without being imprisoned by it. Ghosts becoming teachers instead of torments. The radio programming includes regular educational segments designed for different age groups, helping children understand historical experience while developing their own capacity for community cooperation and emergency preparedness. These programs balance realistic information about potential challenges with optimistic messages about human capacity for survival, recovery, and growth. Cultural productions increasingly focus on themes of resilience, recovery, and intergenerational wisdom transmission. Children's literature includes stories about siege experience that emphasize community cooperation and mutual aid, rather than just individual survival. theatre productions explore relationships between survivors and their children, addressing both the burdens and gifts that trauma experience creates for family relationships. Community organisations have developed programs that pair siege survivors with younger residents, creating mentorship relationships that serve both practical and emotional functions. Older residents share practical knowledge about food preservation, resource management, and community cooperation, while younger participants provide energy, technological skills, and fresh perspectives on contemporary challenges. At night, lying in your comfortable apartment with reliable heat and adequate food, you listen to sounds that include both continuity and change. The ordinary urban noises of traffic, conversations, and music continue as they did before siege experience. But now they're accompanied by subtle indications of a community that has learned to value stability while remaining prepared for potential disruption. The sounds of people who appreciate abundance without taking it for granted. The children of post-siege Leningrad represent both the city's greatest achievement and its most important responsibility. They are growing up in a community shaped by extreme adversity but not defined by it, learning from historical experience while building their own relationships with possibility and hope. They carry forward both the wisdom and the burdens of their elders' survival, creating new traditions that honour the past while embracing the future. These children will never experience the particular combination of terror and resilience that shaped their parents and grandparents, but they are developing their own forms of strength based on community solidarity, mutual aid, and appreciation for ordinary abundance. They're the living proof that survival can become the foundation for a growth, that trauma can be transformed into wisdom, and that communities can build better futures from the lessons learned through suffering. You wake up in March, 7 years after the siege ended, and your pillow is still just a pillow, but the morning light reveals a city where two distinct populations are learning to understand each other across an experiential divide that no amount of sympathy can completely bridge. Outside your window, teenagers who were small children during the starvation months play alongside peers who have no direct memory of systematic hunger, and their interactions reflect both shared community identity and profound differences in fundamental assumptions about security, abundance, and the predictability of daily life. Your apartment has become a repository of objects that tell stories younger visitors can't fully comprehend. The radio that carried both hope and propaganda during the worst months now provides normal programming, but you still feel grateful when it broadcasts without interruption. The cooking pots that once boiled leather for protein now prepare normal meals, but you still clean them with the thoroughness of someone who understands that waste can mean death. These habits puzzle younger neighbours who see them as endearing eccentricities rather than necessary adaptations to circumstances they hope never to encounter. Elena's daughter, Marina, represents the complex psychology of children who experience siege conditions during crucial developmental years. Now 14, she demonstrates remarkable maturity and community awareness alongside persistent anxiety about resource security and change. She excels academically while displaying compulsive behaviours around food storage and sharing. Her relationship with abundance includes both gratitude and suspicion, appreciation for plenty mixed with underlying tension about its potential disappearance. She saves everything, Eleanor explains during one of your regular conversations about child development in post-siege families. Food, clothing, school supplies, even pieces of string and paper that might someday prove useful. I try to teach her that saving is wise, but hoarding is unnecessary. But she's learned lessons during her childhood that I can't completely undo with logic and reassurance. Her brain developed during scarcity, so abundance feels temporary and potentially deceptive. Your work now includes counselling families where siege survivors are raising children born after recovery began. These families navigate complex dynamics where parents who learn to survive through hypervigilance and resource conservation are attempting to raise children in environments of relative plenty and security. The parenting challenges involve teaching appropriate caution without transmitting trauma, sharing survival wisdom without generating unnecessary anxiety. The educational system has developed specialised programs for different populations of children, those who experience siege conditions directly, those who were evacuated and returned, those born during recovery, and those born after normal conditions resumed. Each group has distinct educational needs, psychological characteristics, and social development patterns that require customised approaches to maximise learning while supporting healthy emotional development. Dmitry Volkov, now 19 and attending university, has become a researcher studying his own generation's psychological development and adaptation patterns. His academic work focuses on resilience factors that enable children to survive extreme adversity while maintaining capacity for normal development, relationships, and hope. His personal experience provides insights that complement formal psychological research with lived understanding of adaptation mechanisms. We're like translators, Dmitry explains during a presentation to psychology students who lack direct experience with extreme adversity. We learned languages of scarcity and abundance, survival and normalcy, individual desperation and community cooperation. Now we help other people understand these different languages while learning to speak the new language of recovery and growth. It's exhausting sometimes, but it's also meaningful work. The memorial culture has evolved to serve multiple generations simultaneously, providing healing spaces for survivors while educating younger residents about historical experience and community resilience. Memorial sites include interactive exhibits that help children understand siege conditions without being traumatized by excessive detail. Educational programs balance historical accuracy with age-appropriate presentation, helping young people appreciate their elders' experience while developing their own sense of security and optimism. But the memorial culture also addresses ongoing controversies about memory, representation, and the appropriate lessons to draw from extreme historical experience. Some survivors advocate for complete honesty about siege horrors, believing younger generations need to understand the full reality of what can happen when systems fail. Others prefer focusing on resilience and recovery, emphasizing human capacity for survival and growth rather than detailed documentation of suffering and death. The family dynamics in siege survivor households continue revealing complex patterns that researchers are documenting for future reference. Children raised by siege survivors tend to display enhanced empathy and community cooperation, alongside persistent anxiety about security and change. They're more likely to share resources automatically, but also more likely to display compulsive saving behaviours and resistance to risk-taking that might seem normal to children from non-trauma households. Your diary entries now include observations about intergenerational relationships and the challenges of communicating across experiential divides. Day 2 to 5, Marina saved half her lunch just in case. Elena frustrated but understands. Dimitri's research presentation impressive. He's becoming bridge between our experience and their future. Young people who don't remember can't fully understand, but they're learning compassion and preparedness. Memory being transformed into wisdom rather than just burden. The radio programming includes regular features about intergenerational dialogue, bringing together siege survivors with younger residents to discuss everything from practical life skills to philosophical perspectives on community, security, and mutual responsibility. These programs serve educational functions while facilitating understanding between populations with vastly different foundational experiences about human nature, social cooperation, and resource management. Cultural productions increasingly explore themes of memory transmission, generational responsibility, and the challenges of building shared community identity across experiential divides. Literature includes works by younger authors who grew up hearing siege stories without experiencing siege conditions, offering perspectives on inherited trauma and the responsibility of carrying forward lessons learned through others' suffering. Theatre productions address family dynamics where survival experience shapes parenting approaches and child development. Community organisations have developed programs that bring together different generational cohorts for practical projects that combine siege survivor expertise with younger residents' energy and innovation. Garden cooperatives benefit from older residents' knowledge of food preservation and resource conservation combined with younger participants' physical capabilities and technological skills. These collaborations create mutual learning opportunities while building cross-generational relationships. Housing development continues incorporating features that reflect siege survivor preferences for community cooperation and emergency preparedness, while accommodating younger residents' expectations for privacy and individual autonomy. New construction includes shared spaces that encourage social connection alongside private areas that allow individual expression. The physical environment supports both community solidarity and personal development. At night, lying in your apartment that has become genuinely comfortable rather than just adequate, you listen to sounds that reflect a community learning to balance historical memory with contemporary optimism. Conversations between neighbours include both appreciation for current abundance and underlying awareness of its potential fragility. Children's laughter carries both innocence and wisdom, reflecting upbringing by parents who understand both human resilience and human vulnerability. The intergenerational dynamics in post-Siege Leningrad represent both challenge and opportunity. The difficulty of communicating across experiential divides, combined with the possibility of transforming trauma into wisdom for future benefit. The children who experience siege conditions are growing into adults with unique perspectives on community, cooperation, and resilience. The children born after recovery are developing their own forms of strength based on inherited wisdom and contemporary opportunities. Together, these generations are creating new forms of community identity that honour historical experience while embracing future possibilities. They are learning to carry forward the lessons of survival without being imprisoned by trauma, to appreciate abundance without losing awareness of its fragility, and to build futures that justify the sacrifices that survival required. You wake up in June, 10 years after the siege ended, and your pillow is still comfortable, but the morning light reveals a city where the children of winter have grown into young adults who carry their unique inheritance of survival wisdom into a world that continues changing around them. Outside your window, the courtyard garden produces vegetables tended by people who learned gardening from siege survivors, but approach it as normal hobby rather than desperate necessity. Their laughter includes both innocence and inherited understanding that food security requires attention and cooperation. Your apartment has evolved into a museum of ordinary objects that carry extraordinary stories, visited regularly by younger neighbours who want to understand how survival items became historical artefacts. The radio that once carried life and death information now provides entertainment and education, but you still feel grateful for its reliable operation. The cooking implements that once prepared survival meals now serve normal family dinners, but they retain the shine of being cleaned by someone who understands the value of every utensil. Elena's daughter Marina, now 21, has become a teacher specialising in emergency preparedness and community resilience education. Her classroom combines traditional academic subjects with practical survival skills, psychological coping strategies, and historical awareness that helps students understand both human vulnerability and human capacity for adaptation. Her teaching style reflects the maturity that comes from childhood experience with extreme adversity, balanced by adult experience with recovery and growth. My students think I'm overprotective sometimes, Marina tells you, during one of your regular conversations about educational approaches for post-crisis generations. They can't understand why I require them to learn food preservation, basic medical care, and community cooperation alongside literature and mathematics. But I know how quickly normal life can become survival exercise, and I want them to be prepared without being afraid. It's delicate balance between wisdom and paranoia. Your work has evolved into policy consultation for other regions throughout the Soviet Union and beyond, helping communities develop resilient systems based on lessons learned from Leningrad's siege experience. The expertise gained through extreme adversity has become valuable for emergency planning, community development, and social policy design. Other cities study Leningrad's recovery model while hoping never to need the survival systems it created. Dmitry Volkov, now 25 and completing his doctoral degree in psychology, has married a woman who was born after the siege ended and brings perspectives unmarked by direct trauma experience. Their relationship represents the complex negotiations required when siege survivors form families with people who lack direct understanding of survival psychology. Their wedding celebration included both normal festivity and subtle acknowledgements of the historical experiences that shaped one partner's fundamental worldview. She helps me remember that normal life is possible and healthy, Dmitry explains during a research interview about intergenerational trauma and recovery. I help her understand why preparedness and community cooperation aren't paranoid responses, but practical wisdom. Together we're trying to build family culture that honours both caution and optimism, both individual growth and community responsibility. Our children will inherit both perspectives. The city's memorial culture has matured into permanent institutions that serve education, research, and healing functions simultaneously. The Siege Museum has become internationally recognised for its comprehensive documentation of civilian response to extreme adversity. Educational programs serve schools throughout the region, while research facilities support ongoing studies of trauma, resilience, and community development. Memorial sites provide gathering places for ongoing community building and remembrance activities. The psychological research, emerging from long-term studies of siege survivors and their children, has begun influencing international understanding of trauma, recovery, and resilience. The experience has demonstrated that communities can not only survive extreme adversity, but transform it into sources of strength, wisdom, and enhanced capacity for cooperation. This research informs emergency planning, mental health services, and community development programs throughout the world. The economic development model created during recovery has become an example of resilient urban planning that balances efficiency with redundancy, growth with sustainability, and individual opportunity with community security. Local food production capabilities, diversified manufacturing, distributed energy systems, and multiple transportation networks create economic stability while maintaining flexibility for emergency adaptation. Other cities adapt these principles for their own circumstances and challenges. Your diary entries now reflect a mature integration of historical experience, with contemporary life and future planning. Day 3050, 10 years since siege ended. Marina teaching emergency preparedness to teenagers who think she's overly cautious. Dimitri's wedding beautiful, 2 different worldviews learning to create shared future. Children who experience siege becoming adults who build from that experience. Legacy being transformed from survival into wisdom for building better communities. The radio programming includes regular features about community development, emergency preparedness, and intergenerational cooperation that serve educational functions while maintaining community connection to shared historical experience. These programs balance practical information about resilience building with cultural programming that celebrates recovery, growth, and hope. The broadcasting reflects a community that has learned to appreciate stability while remaining prepared for potential challenges. Cultural productions have evolved to explore themes of legacy, responsibility, and the transformation of trauma into wisdom for future benefit. Literature includes works by authors who experienced siege conditions and those who inherited its psychological legacy, offering different perspectives on memory, recovery, and community building. Theatre productions address contemporary challenges while drawing on historical experience for guidance and inspiration. Educational systems throughout the region have incorporated lessons from Leningrad's experience into curriculum designed to build both individual capabilities and community resilience. Students learn practical skills for the emergency situations alongside traditional academic subjects. Emphasis on community cooperation, mutual aid, and collective responsibility reflects understanding that individual success depends on community strength, and that communities thrive when individuals contribute their capabilities for common benefit. Community organizations continue developing programs that maintain social bonds created during crisis, while adapting them for contemporary needs and opportunities. Neighborhood cooperatives, resource-sharing systems, and mutual aid networks operate as normal community features rather than emergency responses. These organizations demonstrate that crisis-born cooperation can become permanent community assets that enhance quality of life during stable periods. Housing development has created architectural forms that support both community cooperation and individual privacy, allowing residents to maintain social connections while pursuing personal goals and interests. Community spaces encourage interaction and resource sharing, while private areas accommodate individual expression and family life. The physical environment reflects lessons learned about balancing individual needs with community resilience. At night, lying in your apartment that represents both personal recovery and community transformation, you listen to sounds that reflect a city that has successfully integrated historical trauma into contemporary identity without being defined or limited by it. Normal urban life continues with underlying awareness of its fragility and appreciation for its abundance. Children's voices carry both inherited wisdom and their own hopes for futures that will build on, rather than merely repeat their elders' experience. The 10-year anniversary of siege recovery marks not an ending, but a milestone in ongoing community development that honours historical experience while embracing contemporary opportunities and future possibilities. The children of winter have grown into adults who carry forward survival wisdom without being imprisoned by the survival trauma. who build communities that reflect lessons learned through extreme adversity while remaining open to growth, change and hope. Their legacy represents the transformation of trauma into wisdom, survival into strength, and individual endurance into community resilience that serves not just their own city, but offers lessons for communities throughout the world. They have proven that human beings can not only survive extreme adversity, but transform it into sources of enhanced capacity for cooperation, appreciation, and hope. The children of winter have become builders of spring, summer, and all the seasons yet to come. You wake up in April, 20 years after the siege ended, and your pillow is just a pillow in an apartment that has become simply a home, rather than a repository of survival artifacts and traumatic memories. Outside your window, young adults who were born after the recovery walk streets that carry no emotional weight for them beyond normal urban navigation. The morning light reveals a city where the physical infrastructure of siege survival, memorial sites, emergency supply depots, community cooperation centres has become background architecture rather than daily reminders of near-death experience. Your apartment retains certain characteristics that younger visitors notice without understanding. The well-stocked pantry that contains months of non-perishable food. The multiple heating sources that provide redundancy against system failure. The radio that occupies a position of honour despite being replaced by newer communication technologies. These features puzzle younger neighbours who see them as quaint habits rather than necessary adaptations to circumstances they've never faced and hope never to encounter. The supply depot has evolved into a standard commercial distribution centre that also serves as an educational facility for emergency management students from throughout the Soviet Union and beyond. Elena, now in her 50s and serving as a consultant for international disaster preparedness organisations, shows visitors through facilities that demonstrate how crisis-born innovations can become permanent improvements to community resilience and efficiency. The hardest part now, Elena explains during one of your regular conversations about long-term recovery dynamics, is maintaining institutional memory and preparedness systems when most people can't imagine why they're necessary. The younger staff members see the emergency protocols, redundant supply routes, and community cooperation programs as bureaucratic overcomplications rather than essential safeguards. They have never experienced system failure, so they don't understand why preventing it requires constant attention and resources. Your work has shifted to documenting siege experience and recovery processes for historical research and future emergency planning. The written records, oral histories, and analytical reports you compile serve academic researchers, policymakers, and emergency planners, while preserving knowledge that might otherwise disappear as direct witnesses age and die. The documentation project represents an attempt to transform lived experience into institutional wisdom that can survive individual memory. Dmitry Volkov, now 35 and a professor of psychology, has published extensively about long-term effects of childhood trauma and recovery patterns in extreme adversity survivors. His research combines personal experience with professional training, providing insights that purely academic researchers couldn't access. But his work also addresses the challenge of maintaining research interest and funding for studies of historical events that younger generations consider ancient history rather than relevant contemporary concerns. Students today think the siege is ancient history, like World War I or the Napoleonic Wars, Dmitry tells you during a research interview about long-term community recovery patterns. They can't imagine supply system failure, systematic starvation, or communities where cooperation meant survival and selfishness meant death for everyone. Their assumptions about human nature, social organisation, and individual responsibility reflect experiences of abundance and security that we couldn't take for granted until relatively recently. The city's memorial culture faces ongoing challenges about relevance, resource allocation, and appropriate balance between remembrance and contemporary priorities. Memorial sites require maintenance and staffing that compete with funding for current community needs. Educational programs must justify their value to school administrators who question whether siege history deserves curriculum time that could be devoted to contemporary subjects and future-oriented skills development. The psychological research that emerged from siege survivor studies has contributed significantly to international understanding of trauma, resilience, and community recovery. But maintaining research funding requires demonstrating contemporary relevance rather than just historical interest. Long-term studies of siege survivors and their descendants provide valuable data about intergenerational trauma transmission and recovery processes, but younger, researchers often prefer studying current crises rather than historical ones. The economic development model created during recovery continues functioning effectively, but its emergency preparedness features seem increasingly unnecessary to residents who have experienced only prosperity and stability. Local food production capabilities, redundant infrastructure systems, and community cooperation networks operate as normal community features, but their crisis response functions receive less attention and resource allocation than their routine operational benefits. Your diary entries now reflect the complex challenges of maintaining crisis-borne improvements during extended periods of stability and prosperity. Day 7300, 20 years since Siege ended. Younger neighbours think my food storage habits are eccentric rather than wise. Elena struggling to maintain emergency preparedness programs that seem unnecessary to people who've never experienced system failure. Historical experience becoming ancient history despite its continuing relevance for future challenges. The radio programming includes occasional features about Siege history, but they compete with contemporary news, entertainment, and educational content that younger audiences find more immediately relevant. Memorial broadcasts on anniversary dates draw primarily older listeners who experienced siege conditions directly or lived through recovery periods. Younger residents often lack interest in historical programming unless it's presented as entertainment rather than education. Cultural productions addressing siege themes face similar challenges about audience interest and contemporary relevance. Literature, theatre, and film about siege experience must compete with contemporary works that address current concerns and future possibilities rather than historical events. Artists who experience siege conditions directly are aging and retiring, while younger artists often prefer exploring themes that reflect their own generational experiences and concerns. Educational systems continue including siege history in curriculum, but teachers must justify its relevance to students who question why they need to learn about events that happened before they were born and seem unlikely to recur. The challenge involves presenting historical experience as source of wisdom and preparedness, rather than just academic requirement. Some educators emphasize practical skills and community cooperation principles, while others focus on historical documentation and analytical thinking development. Community organizations that emerged from siege experience continue operating effectively, but they must adapt their missions and activities to attract younger members who lack direct connection to historical origins. Neighborhood cooperatives, resource-sharing networks, and mutual aid systems function as normal community features, but younger participants often don't understand their emergency response capabilities or the historical circumstances that created them. Housing development continues incorporating features that support community cooperation and emergency preparedness, but newer residents often view these features as design quirks rather than practical necessities. Community spaces, shared resources areas, and redundant utility systems operate effectively, but their crisis response functions receive less appreciation and maintenance than their routine community benefits. At night, lying in your apartment that has become comfortable and familiar rather than symbolically significant, you listen to sounds of a city that has successfully integrated historical trauma into contemporary identity while moving beyond crisis-defined existence. Normal urban life continues with underlying strength and resilience that most residents take for granted rather than consciously appreciate. The 20-year anniversary of siege recovery represents both achievement and challenge. The success of transforming crisis response into sustainable community improvement combined with the difficulty of maintaining crisis-born wisdom when crisis seems impossible to younger generations. The city has recovered completely from siege trauma while retaining survival-based strengths, but preserving those strengths requires ongoing attention and resource allocation that compete with contemporary priorities and future-oriented investments. You wake up in September, 25 years after the siege ended, and your pillow exists in an apartment where the artifacts of survival have gradually been replaced by ordinary possessions that carry no historical weight beyond personal preference and aesthetic choice. Outside your window, middle-aged adults who were children during the siege walk alongside younger residents for whom the starvation months represent ancient history rather than living memory. The morning light reveals a city where prosperity has become so normal that the infrastructure of emergency preparedness seems like expensive overcaution rather than prudent planning. Your apartment has evolved into a standard middle-class home with some peculiarities that reflect your personal history rather than ongoing survival concerns. The well-stocked pantry, multiple heating sources, and communication equipment that once served emergency functions now appear to be the hobbies of someone who enjoys preparedness as an intellectual exercise rather than practical necessity. Younger neighbours who visit express polite curiosity about your interesting collections without understanding their origins in life and death decision-making. Elena has retired from active emergency management work and now serves as a consultant for historical preservation projects and international disaster preparedness conferences. Her expertise is increasingly sought by academic researchers and policymakers who want to understand how communities can prepare for and recover from extreme disruptions, but her practical experience seems increasingly irrelevant to daily operations in a city where supply systems function reliably and community cooperation occurs automatically through normal social institutions. Nobody wants to hear about supply system failure when the grocery stores are always full, Eleanor tells you, during one of your regular conversations about the challenges of maintaining institutional memory during extended prosperity. The younger managers at the supply depot think the emergency protocols and redundant systems are wasteful bureaucracy rather than essential insurance. They want to streamline operations, reduce costs, and eliminate what they see as unnecessary complexity left over from historical circumstances that won't recur. Your work has become primarily archival, preserving documentation and oral histories that might otherwise be lost as direct witnesses die or retire. The Historical Preservation Project faces ongoing challenges about funding, relevance, and competition with contemporary priorities that seem more urgent to administrators who must allocate limited resources among competing demands. The written records and analytical reports you compile serve researchers and policymakers, but they struggle to maintain institutional support in environments where siege experience seems like ancient history. Dmitry Volkov has achieved significant academic recognition for his research on trauma and resilience, but his work increasingly addresses contemporary crises rather than historical siege experience. His current research focuses on refugee communities, disaster survivors, and other populations experiencing acute stress and recovery processes. While his siege experience provides valuable insights, maintaining research funding requires demonstrating relevance to current concerns rather than just historical interest. The siege shaped everything about how I understand human psychology and community dynamics, Dmitry explains during a recent conference presentation about resilience research methodologies. But I can't build an entire career on a single historical event, especially one that younger colleagues consider too distant to provide meaningful insights for contemporary challenges. I use siege-based understanding to analyse current situations, but I don't often mention the historical origins of my theoretical frameworks. The city's memorial culture has been consolidated and professionalised, with major sites maintained as historical attractions, while smaller memorials are integrated into urban development projects or quietly removed during neighbourhood renovations. The remaining memorial sites serve important educational and ceremonial functions, but they compete with other cultural institutions for public attention, visitor interest and resource allocation. School groups visit memorial sites as required curriculum activities rather than emotional pilgrimages. The psychological research that began with Siege Survivor studies has evolved into broader investigations of trauma, resilience and community recovery that address contemporary challenges throughout the world. While siege experience provided foundational insights, current research focuses on refugee populations, natural disaster survivors, and other groups experiencing acute stress and recovery processes. The historical siege research continues, but it represents specialised academic interest rather than immediate practical concern. The economic development model that emerged from recovery continues functioning effectively, but its emergency preparedness features receive less attention and resource allocation as they seem increasingly unnecessary to residents and administrators who have experienced only prosperity and stability. Local food production, redundant infrastructure, and community cooperation systems operate as normal community features, but their crisis response capabilities are viewed as expensive luxuries rather than essential safeguards. Your diary entries now reflect the complex challenges of preserving crisis-born wisdom during extended periods of peace and prosperity. Day 9025. 25 years since Siege ended, younger city managers want to eliminate redundant emergency systems that seem wasteful during prosperous times. Elena's expertise valued by international organisations but considered irrelevant by local administrators. Historical experience becoming academic curiosity rather than practical guidance for future preparedness. The radio programming rarely includes siege-related content except during anniversary periods, and even then it competes with contemporary news, entertainment, and educational content that audiences find more immediately relevant. Memorial broadcasts draw primarily elderly listeners, while younger residents prefer programming that addresses current concerns and future opportunities rather than historical events they consider ancient history. Cultural productions addressing siege themes face increasing challenges about audience interest and commercial viability. Publishers, theatre directors, and film producers prefer contemporary works that address current concerns and attract younger audiences rather than historical pieces that appeal primarily to elderly residents who experience siege conditions directly. Artists who create siege-related works often must frame them as universal human interest stories rather than specific historical documentation. Educational systems continue including siege history in curriculum, but it receives reduced emphasis as educators focus on contemporary challenges and future-oriented skills development. Teachers must compete for limited curriculum time while justifying the relevance of historical events to students who question why they need to learn about circumstances that seem unlikely to recur. Some schools have eliminated siege education entirely, while others present it as brief historical overview rather than detailed study of survival strategies and community cooperation. Community organisations that emerge from siege experience continue operating effectively, but they function as normal community institutions rather than emergency response networks. Younger members often don't understand the historical origins of cooperative practices and mutual aid systems that they've inherited as community traditions. Neighbourhood cooperatives and resource-sharing networks operate automatically, but their crisis response capabilities receive little attention or conscious development. Housing development continues incorporating community cooperation features, but newer construction emphasises individual convenience and contemporary design preferences over emergency preparedness and community resilience. Shared spaces and redundant utility systems are maintained where they exist. But new development projects often eliminate these features as unnecessary complications that increase construction costs without providing obvious benefits to residents who expect individual autonomy and technological convenience. At night, lying in your apartment that represents both personal comfort and historical continuity, you listen to sounds of a city that has successfully transcended crisis-defined existence while maintaining some of the strengths that crisis created. Normal urban life continues with underlying resilience that most residents neither recognise nor consciously maintain, creating both security and vulnerability that younger generations don't fully appreciate. The 25-year anniversary of siege recovery highlights the paradox of successful recovery. The better the recovery, the less relevant the original crisis seems to subsequent generations. The city has achieved prosperity and stability so complete that the emergency preparedness systems and community cooperation practices that enabled survival and recovery appear to be expensive luxuries rather than essential insurance against future challenges. You wake up in January, 30 years after the siege ended, and your pillow rests in an apartment that has become a small private museum of objects whose significance is known primarily to you and a diminishing number of elderly neighbours who share similar collections of survival artefacts transformed into household decorations. Outside your window, the courtyard that once served as desperate foraging ground now hosts a small playground where children play games that bear no resemblance to the survival exercises their grandparents once conducted in the same space. Your apartment contains items that tell stories to visitors who listen politely without fully comprehending their significance. The radio occupies its position of honour, now surrounded by modern communication devices that provide more reliable and varied information services. The cooking implements retain their careful maintenance, though they're supplemented by convenience appliances that represent technologies unavailable during survival periods. The well-stocked pantry continues containing emergency supplies, though younger neighbours who help with grocery shopping consider your purchasing habits an endearing eccentricity rather than prudent preparation. Elena passed away last year, leaving behind archives of documentation and emergency preparedness protocols that her successors are slowly reducing, consolidating, or eliminating as unnecessarily complex for contemporary supply management needs. Her funeral drew hundreds of attendees who recognised her contributions to community recovery and international disaster preparedness, but the mourners were primarily elderly residents and academic researchers rather than current city administrators or younger community members who might carry forward her practical wisdom. The supply depot operates as a standard commercial distribution centre, with some historical exhibits that attract occasional visitors interested in siege history. The emergency preparedness protocols, redundant supply systems, and community cooperation networks that Elena developed continue functioning automatically, but they receive minimal attention or resource allocation from managers who consider them expensive over complications left over from historical circumstances that modern supply chain management has made obsolete. Your work has become entirely archival, creating comprehensive documentation of siege experience and recovery processes for historical research collections that serve academic institutions and policy organisations throughout the world. The Oral History Project has recorded hundreds of survivor testimonies, creating permanent records of experiences that will otherwise disappear when the last witnesses die. But the documentation project faces ongoing questions about relevance and resource allocation from administrators who must balance historical preservation against contemporary priorities. Dmitry Volkov has become an internationally recognised expert on trauma and resilience, whose research serves refugee assistance programs, disaster recovery organisations, and mental health institutions throughout the world. His work continues drawing on insights developed through siege experience, but he rarely mentions the historical origins of his theoretical frameworks when presenting to audiences who consider such old events irrelevant to contemporary challenges. His academic success represents the transformation of personal trauma into professional contribution that serves communities far beyond Leningrad. The city's memorial culture has been consolidated into several major sites that serve historical education and ceremonial functions, while smaller memorials have been quietly removed during urban development projects. The remaining memorial sites operate as standard historical attractions that compete with other cultural institutions for tourist attention and educational relevance. School visits continue, but their brief curriculum requirements rather than meaningful engagement with community history and survival wisdom. The psychological research that began with siege survivor studies has contributed foundational insights to international understanding of trauma, resilience, and community recovery. But current research focuses on contemporary crises rather than historical events. Long-term studies of siege survivors and their descendants provide valuable longitudinal data, but maintaining research funding requires demonstrating immediate practical applications rather than just academic interest in historical phenomena. The economic development model that emerged from recovery continues providing prosperity and stability, but its emergency preparedness features are increasingly viewed as expensive luxuries rather than essential insurance. Local food production capabilities, redundant infrastructure systems, and community cooperation networks function effectively, but they receive reduced resource allocation as administrators focus on efficiency and cost reduction rather than crisis response capability maintenance. Your diary entries now reflect the completion of historical cycles and the challenge of transmitting experiential wisdom across generational boundaries. Day 10,050, 30 years since siege ended, Elena's funeral well attended, but her expertise dying with her generation. Younger administrators eliminating redundant systems we built with such care and necessity. Historical experience becoming ancient history despite continuing relevance for future preparedness. Perhaps this is natural cycle. Each generation must learn its own lessons rather than inheriting others' wisdom. The radio programming includes brief siege commemorations during anniversary periods, but they're primarily cultural programming rather than educational content about emergency preparedness or community cooperation. Younger audiences prefer contemporary news and entertainment, while elderly listeners who remember siege conditions are becoming too few to justify specialised programming. The institutional memory of survival experience is gradually disappearing from public discourse. Cultural productions addressing siege themes are now primarily historical works created for academic and tourist audiences rather than community education or emotional processing. Literature, theatre and film about Siege experience serve specialised markets, while contemporary cultural production focuses on current concerns and future possibilities. The artistic community that emerged from the Siege experience has largely retired or shifted to other themes that attract younger audiences. Educational systems continue including Siege history as brief curriculum coverage, but it's presented as historical information rather than practical guidance for emergency preparedness or community cooperation. Students learn basic facts about siege dates and casualty figures without developing understanding of survival strategies, resource management, or psychological coping mechanisms that might prove valuable in future challenges. The educational focus has shifted to contemporary skills and future-oriented preparation. Community organisations that emerge from Siege experience continue operating as normal social institutions, but their emergency response capabilities and mutual aid functions receive little attention or conscious development. Neighbourhood cooperatives, resource-sharing networks, and community support systems function automatically as inherited social traditions rather than deliberately maintained emergency preparedness networks. The community cooperation skills that enabled survival are preserved through normal social interaction rather than conscious preparation. Housing development emphasises contemporary comfort and individual convenience rather than community cooperation and emergency preparedness. Shared spaces and redundant utility systems are maintained where they exist, but new construction eliminates such features as unnecessary complications that increase costs without providing obvious benefits to residents who expect technological solutions and individual autonomy rather than community cooperation and mutual aid. At night, lying in your apartment that represents both personal continuity and historical conclusion, you listen to sounds of a city that has completely transcended crisis-defined existence while retaining some resilience capabilities that most residents neither recognise nor consciously maintain. Normal urban life continues with underlying strength that operates automatically through inherited social institutions and infrastructure systems rather than conscious community preparation. The 30-year anniversary of Siege recovery marks the completion of historical recovery and the beginning of post-historical existence. The city has achieved prosperity so complete that Siege experience seems like ancient history rather than recent trauma. The emergency preparedness systems and community cooperation practices that enabled survival and recovery have become invisible infrastructure rather than conscious community capabilities. Perhaps this represents the ultimate success, recovery so complete that the original crisis becomes historically irrelevant rather than psychologically defining. The children and grandchildren of Siege survivors live normal lives unmarked by trauma or hypervigilance, trusting in social institutions and technological systems to provide security and abundance. They've inherited resilience capabilities without inheriting survival anxiety, community cooperation skills without emergency psychology, appreciation for abundance without conscious fear of scarcity. The final lesson of Siege recovery might be that successful community healing eventually makes its own origins unnecessary. The city has learned to survive extreme adversity, recover from trauma, and build prosperity from collapse. But the greatest achievement is that such learning has become unnecessary for subsequent generations who inherit security as normal condition rather than hard-won recovery from disaster. The Siege of Leningrad ended not with dramatic conclusion, but with gradual disappearance into historical memory, leaving behind a city stronger than before but no longer defined by strength, more resilient than previously but no longer conscious of resilience, more appreciative of abundance and community but no longer dependent on appreciation for survival. The true victory is that victory itself has become invisible, normal, taken for granted by people who've never needed to fight for their lives or their community. Your story ends not with climactic resolution, but with ordinary mourning in comfortable apartment, surrounded by objects whose significance survives primarily in your memory, and similar collections maintained by diminishing number of elderly neighbours. The Siege shaped everything about how you understand life, community, resilience, and hope, but its influence has become invisible foundation for normal existence rather than conscious survival strategy. Perhaps that's the most important lesson. Successful recovery creates conditions where recovery becomes unnecessary. Survival wisdom transforms into ordinary life skills, and extraordinary human resilience becomes the hidden foundation for perfectly normal existence. The children of winter have grown into adults of summer, and their children will live in all seasons without remembering that winter once meant death. Spring meant hope, and survival meant everything that makes life worth living. You close your diary for the final time on a warm June evening, 35 years after the siege ended. The courtyard below fills with the laughter of children who will never know that their playground was once a desperate search ground for anything edible. The bread trucks arrive on schedule, their drivers unconscious of the miracle they represent to someone who once counted every gram as the difference between tomorrow and nothing. In your kitchen, you prepare dinner from ingredients that would have seemed fantastical during the starvation months: fresh vegetables, real bread, actual meat. Your hands move automatically through preparations that represent normalcy reclaimed from chaos, abundance restored from scarcity, life continuing after death seemed inevitable. The radio plays music from younger composers who write about love and hope without the undertones of survival that mark your generation's cultural production. Their melodies carry lightness that belongs to people who've never had to choose between eating and heating, never calculated whether to share their last bread or hoard it, never wondered if they'd see another spring. Through your window, the summer sun sets over a city that has completely transcended its siege identity. The buildings have been rebuilt, these streets repaired, the population restored. Leningrad has become a thriving metropolitan centre whose prosperity erases almost all visible evidence of the 900 days when it became humanity's experiment in how long 3 million people can survive on almost nothing. Almost all the evidence. Your apartment remains a small museum of survival artifacts whose significance you alone fully understand. The books that served as pillows, the pot that boiled leather into something approaching food, the ration cards carefully preserved in frames that younger neighbours admire as interesting historical curiosities without grasping their life or death significance. Elena's archives have been donated to the State Historical Society, where they'll serve researchers studying disaster, preparedness and community resilience for generations to come. Her practical wisdom has been transformed into academic knowledge, her survival expertise converted into theoretical frameworks that will help communities far beyond Leningrad prepare for challenges they hope never to face. Dmitry Volkov's work continues influencing international humanitarian efforts, refugee assistance programs and trauma recovery initiatives worldwide. The boy who survived both Leningrad starvation and Kazakhstan evacuation has become a voice for displaced populations everywhere, transforming personal trauma into professional contribution that serves suffering communities across the globe. The children who played in courtyards where you once searched for frozen potato peels have become adults with careers, families and comfortable lives built on foundations they don't recognise or appreciate. They've inherited resilience capabilities without understanding their origins, community cooperation skills without knowing their crisis-born necessity, appreciation for abundance without conscious memory of scarcity. Perhaps this is as it should be. Each generation deserves to build its own experiences rather than living in the shadow of ancestors' traumas. The children of siege survivors have earned the right to ordinary concerns, normal anxieties and comfortable complaints about inconveniences that would have seemed luxurious during the winter of 1941-42. Your diary contains 10,750 daily entries documenting the transformation from normal citizen to desperate survivor to traumatized recoverer to elderly witness whose experience becomes history rather than living memory. The entries trace a journey from that last normal breakfast on June 2nd to 41, through 872 days of systematic starvation, through slow recovery and gradual healing, to this quiet evening when the past feels both vivid and impossibly distant. The final entry reads simply, Day 12,775, 35 years since siege ended. Completed oral history project. Elena gone, Mrs. Kozlova gone, Pavel gone, most of us gone. But the city remains, the children laugh, the bread arrives. Winter comes and goes without killing anyone. Perhaps that's victory, enough, that tomorrow has become ordinary again instead of miraculous. Perhaps that's all we were fighting for, the right to boring, comfortable, unremarkable existence for those who came after. You close the diary and place it carefully on your shelf alongside Elena's published memoirs, Dmitry's research publications, and the growing collection of historical studies about siege experience and recovery processes. These documents will outlive you, serving researchers and policymakers for generations to come, transforming personal suffering into collective wisdom. Outside, the White Nights phenomenon paints the sky in ethereal twilight just as it did on that last normal evening before war arrived. The same endless summer light that illuminated your final hours of innocence now shines on a city that has learned, forgotten, and transcended its darkest chapters while maintaining invisible resilience born from impossible survival. The Siege of Leningrad ended not with dramatic liberation, but with gradual disappearance into the comfortable obscurity of historical memory. The 900-day winter that killed approximately 1 million people and tested 3 million more has become a historical event studied by scholars rather than a living memory shaping daily existence. And perhaps that represents the truest victory, that extraordinary suffering has faded into ordinary history, that crisis-born wisdom has dissolved into invisible cultural foundations, that the children of winter have become ancestors of spring without transmitting the anxiety and hypervigilance that survival once demanded. You wouldn't have survived the Siege of Leningrad. Not easily, not without sacrifice, suffering, and scars that last forever. But some people did survive, and their survival created lessons about human resilience, community cooperation, and the extraordinary capacities ordinary people discover when circumstances eliminate all alternatives to strength. The echo fades, the ghosts rest, the city breathes, and somewhere in the courtyard below, children play guessing games in the twilight, blissfully unaware that their playground was once a battlefield, where the weapons were hunger and cold and the victory was simply seeing another dawn. Perhaps that's the final lesson. The greatest triumph of survival is that it eventually becomes unnecessary, Eurus, allowing future generations to take for granted the ordinary abundance that you once fought every day to achieve. The siege ends here, in comfortable apartment on quiet summer evening, with diary closed and story complete. Not with dramatic resolution, but with peaceful acceptance that extraordinary experience has fulfilled its purpose by creating conditions where such experience never needs repeating. Rest now. The bread will arrive tomorrow, the children are safe, and winter will come and go without killing anyone. You survived, and your survival helped create a world where survival itself needs no longer define existence. That's enough. That's everything. That's victory.